the Godless War. In the beginning, there was only faith. Faith that shaped empires, faith that burned worlds, faith that bound men to a divine cause they could neither question nor escape. It was a force so strong that entire civilizations were built upon it, anchored by the belief that their gods demanded order, obedience, and sacrifice. At the heart of this cosmic faith was Xarathos, a religion so powerful it had spread like wildfire across the galaxy, consuming planets with promises of eternal glory and salvation for those who bowed before its divine laws. For centuries, theocratic rule dominated. Xarathos had united 7 planets under its brutal regime, controlling not just the bodies of its followers but their very souls. To live for Xarathos was to surrender all: freedom, individuality, and choice. To die for Xarathos was the greatest honor, martyrdom the shining jewel promised to every believer who spilled their blood for the cause. But as the empire of Xarathos grew, so too did the whispers of rebellion. On the secular planets, far from the reach of divine authority, there were those who questioned, those who dared to dream of a galaxy where gods did not rule, where men could live free from the chains of belief. These were the secularists, a coalition of worlds that had forsaken the divine in favor of autonomy, progress, and choice. The war that followed, the Godless War, was not fought over resources nor territory. It was a war of ideas, of beliefs so deeply held that they ignited the stars. For the believers of Xarathos, it was a holy war, a battle for the soul of the galaxy, a test of their faith. For the secular planets, it was a fight for survival, for the right to live without gods dictating their fate. In the final days of the conflict, it was neither bullets nor bombs that would decide the outcome. It was the choice to reject faith, to stand against the divine, and declare that the gods had no power here. It was the choice to kill a god. And in the ashes of that choice, the galaxy would be forever changed. Chapter 1. Beneath the Watchful Eyes. The sun hung low in the sky, its final rays casting an orange glow over the blackened rooftops of Torvenus. A quiet hum filled the air as the city's prayer bells rang out, signaling the approach of sunset. Every citizen knew what came next. They stopped what they were doing: children at play, merchants at their stalls, workers in the factories, each one pausing to face the great statue of Xarathos that loomed over the central plaza. Zara knelt slowly on the rough stone of the street, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed them together in reverence. Her lips moved silently, repeating the prayer she had memorized since childhood, her gaze never leaving the cold, expressionless face of Xarathos. The deity's carved eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went, an ever-present reminder of her purpose, her duty. She took comfort in it. There was peace in knowing what was expected. Across the plaza, Malik stood rigid, barely bowing his head as the bells tolled. His mouth formed the words out of habit, but his eyes darted across the crowd, scanning the faces of the faithful. His engineering shift at the solar processing plant had ended an hour earlier, yet here he was, still performing the daily ritual. He gritted his teeth, annoyed by the strictness of the evening prayers. But what choice did he have? Questioning the rituals, even silently, was dangerous. Dissent lingered in the air like a bad smell, and anyone who didn't show the proper devotion was reported, usually by someone close. Malik's friend Zara had already turned in a neighbor once, years ago. He still remembered the day the police had taken the man away, his eyes wide with disbelief. Zara had been proud, her head held high as she watched them drag him through the street. She believed in the mission of Xarathos with all her heart. The prayer ended, and the crowd rose in unison, casting brief glances at one another, as if checking for signs of hesitation. Then, like clockwork, the people of Torvenus resumed their tasks. Zara stood too, her back straight, her face smooth and unreadable. Malik shot her a glance as she approached. "Your form was off today," she said lightly, adjusting the long gray robe she wore, the color marking her as a devoted enforcer of Xarathos's will. "Your bow was too shallow." Only a little tired, Malik said, forcing a smile. Long day at the plant. Don't let it slip. You know what they say. Zara's voice was softer now, almost kind. But Malik didn't miss the warning in her words. Small lapses lead to large doubts. He nodded, suppressing the urge to argue. Zara was right, of course. Every moment was a test of faith, and those who failed weren't just punished, they were erased. Their names removed from the records, their images wiped from public archives, as if they had never existed. As they walked together through the narrow streets, the sharp staccato of boots echoed nearby. A group of enforcers marched past, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows of the alleyways. One of the enforcers, a tall, stern man named Vornis, glanced at Zara and nodded in acknowledgement. She returned the gesture, pride swelling in her chest. Vornis was one of the elite, an executor of Xarathos. The executives were the highest authority under the deity, second only to the prophets who interpreted the scripture. Malik's stomach twisted as he watched them pass. Vornis had been present the day Malik's older brother, Arlen, had been taken. Arlen had questioned the laws once, just once, quietly, after a particularly brutal public execution. It wasn't even a full question, more of a comment on the necessity of such harsh punishments. But someone had overheard. That was enough. Zara noticed his discomfort and frowned. You're still thinking about Arlen, aren't you? Malik kept his eyes forward. It's hard not to. You have to let it go. He was weak. The word struck him like a blow, but Malik swallowed his anger. This was the world they lived in. Xarathos demanded loyalty, absolute and unquestioning. Even family could be a liability if they strayed from the path. They turned a corner and found themselves in the marketplace, where the scent of roasted meat and spice filled the air. Merchants called out from stalls, but their voices lacked the usual energy. Business had slowed, and the occasional glance at the watchful eyes of the enforcers patrolling the square kept people subdued. They're talking about new laws, Zara said casually, running her fingers along the edge of a stall as they walked. Stricter dress codes for women, more structured roles for children in the factories. Xarathos wills it. Malik exhaled slowly, the weight of the news settling on him like a heavy cloak. More structure, he echoed, because we don't have enough already. Zara gave him a sharp look. You sound ungrateful. We have purpose, Malik. We are blessed with the clarity of Xarathos' vision. Without it, we'd be like the godless planets, wandering, lost, no sense of duty. Malik couldn't argue without risking suspicion, so he kept silent. The godless planets, as Xarathos' followers called them, were a constant reminder of what happened to societies that didn't follow the faith. Secular, they said, permissive, unholy. They let their people believe whatever they wanted, as if faith could be optional. Malik had once been curious about those places, what it would be like to live without the constant pressure of devotion, without the laws dictating every aspect of life. But curiosity, he knew, was dangerous. As they neared the edge of the market, a commotion broke out. Two men argued loudly near a stall selling religious trinkets. One of the men, a street vendor, was gesturing angrily at the other, a young man with a shaved head and torn sleeves. I said, "Get away from my stall," the vendor shouted, clutching a small figurine of Xarathos. You mock the deity with your blasphemy? The young man's face twisted in defiance. Blasphemy? I speak the truth. Xarathos is a lie, a puppet of those who control us. We're nothing but slaves, and you, he pointed to the vendor, then to the crowd gathering around them. You're all blind. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Zara stiffened beside Malik, her eyes narrowing. He's one of them, she muttered. A heretic. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, raising her hand in command. Arrest him! Two enforcers rushed forward, grabbing the young man by the arms and dragging him to his knees. He struggled, but Zara's gaze was cold, her loyalty unwavering. Xarathos sees your defiance. she said, her voice echoing with authority. "You'll answer for your heresy." The young man spat at her feet. "You can't arrest us all." "You'll see. More are coming. The truth will." His words were cut off as one of the enforcers struck him across the face. Malik turned away, unable to watch. The laws were clear. Question the deity, and you lose everything. Your freedom, your life, your very existence. As Zara ordered the man to be taken away, Malik felt a gnawing sense of unease. He could no longer pretend that everything was right. The constant surveillance, the public executions, the rigid control of every aspect of life, it was suffocating. And yet, here he was, going through the motions like everyone else. But for how long? The night fell, and the statue of Xarathos cast long shadows over the city, its presence a constant reminder of the deity's rule. Malik glanced at Zara, whose face was set in stone, her faith unshakable. And then he looked at the fading trail of the heretic, his words echoing in Malik's mind. Perhaps there was more to question. Perhaps the truth, hidden beneath centuries of law and control, was far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Secular Shields. The planet of Xarathos had always been a place of peace. Its sprawling cities hummed with the quiet rhythm of life, its skies a calm cerulean, unmarred by the scars of war. On Xarathos, the people lived as they wished, free from the strict doctrines and heavy-handed laws that defined. Xarathos. Freedom of belief was a cornerstone of their society, an idea so ingrained that it was seldom questioned. But something had begun to change. Daria had noticed it for months now, small, subtle signs at first. A conversation cut short when she approached. A flyer left in a cafe, its bold letters speaking of a higher purpose, a path to enlightenment through Xarathos. She'd seen more of them lately, handed out by newcomers to Xarathos, immigrants seeking asylum from a harsh regime on Torvenus. What had once been whispers of an unknown religion had grown louder, bolder. She stood at the entrance of the Plaza of Voices, where a crowd was already gathering. The plaza was known for hosting debates, public forums where anyone could speak their mind. Today, however, the air felt tense. Daria moved closer, weaving through clusters of onlookers, until she reached the edge of the platform where two men stood facing each other. One of them, dressed in flowing blue robes, was Jonas, a respected philosopher and advocate of Xarathos' secular principles. He spoke calmly, hands clasped in front of him. Across from him stood Rayan, a recent convert to Xarathos, his posture rigid with conviction, his eyes ablaze with purpose. He wore a simple, rough tunic, nothing like the ceremonial garb of Torvenus' elite, but the emblem of Xarathos was etched into the fabric over his heart. "They tell you that submission is freedom," Jonas was saying, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "That to surrender your will to Xarathos will bring you peace. But what they offer is not peace, it is servitude. We on Xarathos have chosen freedom of thought, freedom of belief. Do not let them take that from us." Ryan's voice cut through the air, sharp and unyielding. "You call it servitude because you do not understand. Xarathos gives us clarity, purpose. It lifts the burden of doubt from our souls. What good is this freedom you speak of when your people wander aimlessly, lost in their lives?" Daria clenched her fists as she listened, her heart pounding. Rayan had been on Xarathos for less than a year. He'd arrived as part of a wave of asylum seekers from Torvenus, people fleeing the war-torn world. Many had come looking for refuge, but not all had left their beliefs behind. Like Rayan, some had found in Xarathos the purpose they claimed they'd been missing all their lives. Jonas, ever calm, replied, "Purpose is not something you are given by a higher power. It is something you find within yourself. Here, we are free to choose our path, to explore, to question. That is true freedom." Rayan stepped forward, raising his hands to the crowd. "And yet your people are dissatisfied. Look around you. Look at how many of your brothers and sisters have turned to Xarathos for answers. They were adrift, and now they have found the truth." The crowd murmured in response, and Daria noticed several heads nodding in agreement. She knew that many in Xarathos' lower districts had already converted, disillusioned by their lives, tired of the endless search for meaning in a world where everything seemed to have no higher order. Xarathos offered them certainty, submission, a release from the burden of free will. Jonas's eyes swept the crowd, his gaze steady. Xarathos offers certainty, yes, but at the cost of your own mind. They tell you what to believe, how to live, and you follow without question. Is that the life you want for your children? For your future? Daria saw the anger flare in Rayon's eyes. "You mock us because you fear us," he spat. "You fear that Xarathos will spread, that your weak secular values cannot stand up to the strength of our faith. And you're right to fear. Xarathos grows because it is the truth. It is inevitable." Before Jonas could respond, a man in the crowd shouted, "Send them back to Torvnes! We don't want your lies here." Daria tensed as the crowd erupted into noise. Some people cheered in support of Jonas, while others shouted for Rayan. Several voices called out, demanding that Xarathos be banned, that Serenos was no place for such extremism. Daria recognized one of the men, Tomas, a former Xarathosian who had fled Torvnes 5 years ago. His voice rose above the others. "They'll poison us from within," Tomas yelled, pushing his way to the front. His face was red with fury. "You don't know what they're capable of!" "I lived through it, the executions, the disappearances. Once you let Xarathos take hold, they'll stop at nothing until they control everything." Others began to join him, shouting for action. Tomas, like many others, had tried to warn Serenos about the dangers of Xarathos. He knew too well what submission to the faith meant. But Serenos' laws of tolerance prevented the government from restricting religious belief, and Xarathos had used those very principles to gain a foothold. Daria caught Tomas's eye and saw the fear in his face. He wasn't just angry. He was terrified. She understood why. Xarathos didn't just convert people. It consumed them. The propaganda was everywhere now. Sermons whispered in the streets, pamphlets handed out in darkened corners, even broadcasts on obscure channels. Illegal immigrants from Torvnes, slipping past Serenos' borders, brought with them stories of their divine mission and slowly, silently, recruited new believers. But it wasn't just the illegal immigrants. Many of those converting to Xarathos were citizens of Serenos, disillusioned by their own lives. They were people like Rayan, who had felt lost in a world where they had too many choices, too much freedom. Xarathos gave them a purpose, a path, an answer to the uncertainty of existence. And that terrified Daria more than anything. As the crowd grew more heated, Daria stepped forward, forcing her way through the throng. She reached Tomas just as the first scuffle broke out, a Xarathosian convert shoving a secularist who had insulted the deity. The plaza erupted into chaos, fists flying, shouts turning to screams. Rayan tried to shout over the violence, calling for calm, but it was too late. "Tomas!" Daria grabbed his arm. "We need to get out of here." Tomas's face was wild with anger, but he let her pull him away from the fray. As they hurried through the crowd, Daria could hear the distant sound of sirens. The authorities would arrive soon, but they would be too late to stop the damage. "They don't see it," Tomas said breathlessly as they ran, his voice shaking. "They don't see what's happening. This is just the beginning, Daria. Xarathos won't stop until they've taken everything." Daria knew he was right. She'd seen it too. The slow but steady rise of Xarathos on Serenos, the way it preyed on the vulnerable, the disillusioned, the lost. And yet, under Serenos' laws, nothing could be done to stop it. Freedom of belief, they called it. But Daria wondered how long that freedom could last before Xarathos' demands for submission became too great to ignore. As they reached the outskirts of the plaza, Daria turned back for one last look. The fighting had escalated, and Rand stood amidst the chaos, watching with a grim satisfaction. Behind him, others like him, new converts to Xarathos, asylum seekers who had once fled the violence of Torvanis, looked on with cold determination. They didn't need to fight. They just needed to wait. Time and faith were on their side. Daria swallowed hard and looked at Tomas. "We need to do something, before it's too late." Tomas nodded, his jaw set. "I know. But how do you fight an idea that feeds on doubt and fear? How do you fight a faith?" Daria didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the cracks in Xarathos' peaceful society were beginning to show. And if they didn't act soon, those cracks would become a fracture that nothing could repair. Chapter 3, Fractured Voices. The capital city of Xarathos hummed with energy, its streets buzzing with conversations and debates, spilling from cafes and market stalls. Large holographic screens floated above the main square, casting their glowing advertisements into the evening air. For months, those screens had been a neutral space, promoting events, art galleries, and philosophical discussions. But recently, something had shifted. The screens had taken on a new tone, a new message. Daria watched as one of the screens flickered to life, showing a serene image of a figure, draped in simple robes, with the symbol of Xarathos glowing behind him. A voice echoed from the speakers, calm and measured, as the figure spoke. "Xarathos offers us a path to unity, to purpose. In a world where so many are lost, it gives us direction. It is time we recognize the faith of Xarathos as one that deserves respect, just as we respect all beliefs here on Xarathos." Daria gritted her teeth. She had been hearing these broadcasts more often now, official government channels praising Xarathos under the guise of inclusivity. What had started as a trickle of converts had grown into a movement, and now the government was getting involved. They spoke of equality, of the right to believe, but Daria knew what this was really about. Xarathos wasn't just another belief. It was a system, a machine, one that sought to control everything in its path. "Another one?" Tomas muttered beside her, his eyes fixed on the screen. Daria nodded, her expression hard. "They're everywhere now, every street corner, every social media feed. It's not just the asylum seekers anymore. People are listening, Tomas. They're buying into it." Tomas ran a hand through his graying hair, a frustrated sigh escaping his lips. "They're buying into the idea of purpose. That's the problem. Xarathos gives them certainty, and people, especially those who are unhappy, cling to certainty like a lifeline." Daria watched as more pedestrians stopped to listen to the broadcast. Some looked intrigued, nodding along with the message. Others wore expressions of discomfort, unsure of where this would lead. She couldn't blame them. Xarathos had always prided itself on its inclusivity. Every belief was welcome here, every voice allowed to speak. But Xarathos was different. It wasn't just a belief, it was an ideology that demanded submission, that silenced any opposition. "They've managed to make it about freedom of belief," Daria said bitterly. "The government is framing anyone who criticizes Xarathos as intolerant, anti-inclusion." Tomas shook his head. "It's a dangerous trap. Xarathos hides behind the language of inclusivity, but we both know what it leads to." As they spoke, a new voice broke through the crowd. A young woman, standing on a nearby platform, held a microphone in her hand. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was determination in her eyes. Daria recognized her immediately. Celine, a former believer of Xarathos. "I was once one of them," Celine began, her voice gaining strength as people turned to listen. "I followed Xarathos, believed in the promises, the certainty, the unity. I thought I had found the truth, a higher purpose. But it was a lie. Xarathos doesn't offer unity. It offers control. It tells you how to think, how to live, and punishes anyone who questions it." The crowd murmured in response. a mix of curiosity and discontent. Daria felt a surge of hope. Selene had been one of the most outspoken former believers, a woman who had escaped Xarathos' grip after years of devotion. Her words carried weight, especially among those who had seen the dangers of the faith firsthand. "They tell you that I'm anti-inclusion," Selene continued, her voice rising with passion. "That I hate the believers of Xarathos. But that's not true. I'm here because people should have the right to choose what they want to believe in their lives. But that does not mean they can take this right from those who disagree with them. You have the right to believe in Xarathos. But I also have the right to disagree, to speak out, to criticize it." Tomas leaned in close to Daria. "She's brave, speaking out like that. She knows the government's already marked her as part of an anti-inclusive group." Daria nodded, admiration filling her. "She won't stay silent. And she's right. If Xarathos keeps growing, they'll drown out every other voice." But not everyone in the crowd was moved by Selene's words. A man stepped forward, his face red with anger. He wore the simple robes of a Xarathos convert, the emblem of the deity embroidered proudly on his chest. His voice was loud, accusing. "Why do you attack our faith?" he shouted. "You call it control, but you're the ones who want to silence us. You can't stand that we've found something that gives us meaning. We have the right to believe, and we won't let you take that from us." Others in the crowd cheered in agreement. Daria felt her heart sink. This was exactly what she had feared. Xarathos was twisting the narrative, turning any opposition into an attack on freedom itself. The government was backing them, framing the debate as a battle between tolerance and intolerance. But it wasn't that simple. Selene didn't back down. She stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze with unwavering resolve. "You have every right to your faith. But that faith doesn't give you the right to silence those who don't believe. Xarathos demands submission, complete, unquestioning loyalty. You can't pretend it's just a belief when it's already taken so much from so many people." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement with Selene. Others stood with the man, shouting insults at her. The divide was growing. Daria could feel it. Xarathos was being torn apart, pulled in different directions by those who believed in inclusivity, those who were wary of Xarathos, and those who had already submitted to it. Tomas shook his head, his expression grim. "The government's already starting to lean in their favor. They're afraid of the backlash if they don't. But if they keep giving Xarathos a platform, it won't be long before it's not just a voice. It'll be the voice." Daria's eyes scanned the crowd, her heart heavy with the weight of what was happening. She had always believed in the principles of Xarathos, freedom, choice, the right to believe or not believe. But how could they protect those freedoms when one belief system demanded the elimination of all others? Selene's voice echoed through the square once more, fierce and unrelenting. "Xarathos thrives on fear and submission. But we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to let it take over. We can resist by speaking out, by standing up for our right to disagree. Xarathos was built on choice, on diversity. Let's not lose that now." Daria felt a surge of pride. Selene was right. They couldn't afford to stay silent. The growing influence of Xarathos was a threat, not just to their freedoms, but to the very foundation of their society. And as the voices of opposition grew louder, Daria knew one thing for certain: the fight for Xarathos' future had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Hunger for Control. The council chambers on Torvenus hummed with a sense of grim satisfaction. The walls were adorned with banners of Xarathos, the emblem of the deity emblazoned in deep crimson against the cold steel. At the head of the chamber, High Executor Vornis stood tall, his hands resting on the edge of the great marble table that dominated the room. Before him sat the other executors, the highest-ranking officials in Xarathos' theocratic hierarchy. "We are seeing results," Vornis said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "The seeds we planted are beginning to grow." The screen behind him flickered to life. displaying images from the secular planets, broadcasts of Xarathos preachers spreading the word in the streets of Xarathos and beyond. Converts in simple robes, their eyes alight with newfound faith, were captured on video, speaking passionately about the truth they had found in Xarathos. The serene, polished cities of the secular worlds were now starting to show cracks. Tensions were rising, unrest simmering just beneath the surface. The executors nodded approvingly as the images flashed by, pride swelling in their chests. The conversion efforts on these secular worlds had been slow at first, a cautious whisper here, a pamphlet there. But now, they were becoming a roaring fire. The people of Xarathos and other secular planets are coming to us, Vornis continued, his tone sharpened with the weight of victory. Those who once wandered without purpose have found their calling in Xarathos. They know now that their old lives were hollow. Executor Lyris, one of the oldest and most devout of Xarathos' council, leaned forward. Her eyes gleamed with fervor, and our influence grows with every conversion. The secular planets claim to be places of freedom, but they do not understand true freedom. True freedom is submission to the will of Xarathos. The more we convert, the more we control. It is only a matter of time before they see the folly of their so-called choices. Vornis smiled darkly. Indeed, and our new efforts to fund these groups, those converts who speak for us, will speed that process. The plan had been set in motion months ago. The government of Torvenus, under the guidance of Xarathos' highest leaders, had begun funneling resources to Xarathosian groups on secular planets. These groups, emboldened by their faith and their sense of divine purpose, had grown in number. Now, with support from Torvenus, they were more than just voices in the crowd. They were becoming movements, well-organized, well-funded, and increasingly vocal. They see us as saviors, Lyris said with quiet satisfaction. We are liberating them from their chaos, from their confusion. Every attack on our faith only strengthens our cause. The governments of the secular planets are too afraid to act decisively. They speak of inclusion, of tolerance, and it is their weakness. Vornis nodded, his expression darkening. But tolerance will only last so long. We have funded the movements. Now, we must do more. These secular worlds are ripe for chaos. We will bring that chaos to them. Lyris frowned slightly, but the others remained silent. Vornis continued, his voice colder now. We know how people react when they are afraid. When they are uncertain, when their lives are unstable, they look for something solid to hold on to. Xarathos is that solid ground. If they are unhappy, they will seek us out. But we must push them to that edge. We must make them feel that unrest. Executor Thalos, a younger member of the council, shifted uneasily. You mean attacks, High Executor? Vornis's eyes flashed with impatience. Yes, small at first. Acts of rebellion, justified as responses to those who insult our faith. These acts will cause division, and as we know, division breeds extremism. The more divided they become, the more they will turn to us for salvation. Thalos hesitated, but Vornis was resolute. We are not simply spreading a faith, Thalos. Xarathos is the future of these worlds, the only future that matters. And sometimes that future must be secured through force. The secular planets will not fall on their own. We must give them a reason to crumble. Lyris's voice was steady, though her gaze remained on Vornis. And when the attacks begin, it will give our followers more reason to rise up. They will see the chaos and know that Xarathos is the only way to bring order. The more unrest we sow, the more they will look to us for stability. Vornis nodded. Exactly. Fear is a powerful weapon, and fear is what will bring them to us, willingly, eagerly. On Xarathos, the tension was palpable. The news feeds buzzed with stories of sudden unrest. Acts of vandalism at secularist monuments, arson at institutions that had once been considered untouchable. There had been small, isolated attacks on government buildings, with leaflets found nearby praising Xarathos and condemning the godless societies that dared to stand against the will of the deity. Authorities had been quick to respond, arresting several suspects linked to radical Xarathos groups, but the damage had already been done. Celine had watched it all unfold with mounting dread. She had known it would come to this. What had started as small groups of peaceful converts had transformed into something far more dangerous. Xarathos was a war-hungry religion. Celine had seen it firsthand during her time on Torvanis, and now it was spreading that hunger to Serenos. As she stood in the dim light of her small apartment, Celine scrolled through her social media feed, her heart sinking. Messages of support for Xarathos filled her screen, posts praising the faith, calls for it to be respected above all others. And then, the darker posts, people justifying the attacks, claiming that the violence was a necessary response to the oppression Xarathosians faced on secular worlds. They're painting themselves as victims, Celine muttered under her breath. And people are buying it. Her feed was full of arguments now. Xarathosian converts accusing anyone who criticized them of intolerance, while others, like Celine, tried desperately to explain the dangers of the faith. But it was an uphill battle. The government, afraid of being seen as anti-inclusive, had started speaking in defense of the Xarathosians, even as the attacks escalated. Celine closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere now, and they were getting louder. A knock at her door snapped her out of her thoughts. She opened it to find Daria standing there, her face pale, her eyes filled with urgency. "Celine, you need to see this," Daria said quickly, stepping inside and pulling out a tablet. "What is it?" Celine asked, her voice tight. Daria handed her the tablet, and Celine's stomach twisted as she watched the footage play out. A group of Xarathosian believers had gathered in the center of Serenos' capital, holding up signs that read, "Inclusion for all," and "Respect our faith." But what started as a peaceful protest had quickly devolved. A small group of secularists had approached, shouting in opposition, and soon fists were flying. Then, in the chaos, one of the Xarathosian protesters had pulled out a makeshift bomb and thrown it toward the crowd. The explosion was small, but it was enough to cause panic. People scattered screaming as smoke billowed into the air. Celine could hear the sirens in the distance as the authorities rushed to contain the situation. "They're starting to attack," Daria said, her voice trembling. "Just like on Torvanis." Celine's chest tightened. "It's only going to get worse. The more violence they create, the more people will turn to Xarathos for safety, for purpose. And the government, they're too afraid to act against them. They're framing it as a freedom issue," Daria said, her voice bitter. "They keep saying Xarathosians deserve the right to express their beliefs, but they don't see what's coming." Celine handed the tablet back, her mind racing. She had lived through this before, seen how it started. It always began the same way, small acts of violence justified by the faith, and then more people turning to Xarathos as the only way to restore order. "We have to do something," Celine said quietly, "before it's too late." Daria's eyes met hers, and in that moment Celine saw the fear and determination that mirrored her own. But could they stop it in time? Chapter 5, The Price of Silence. Serenos was a planet of ideals. Its streets hummed with the quiet hum of advanced technology. Hover cars gliding effortlessly through the air, automated factories churning out goods at efficient speeds. Citizens prided themselves on their education, their open society, and their technological advancement. The universities of Serenos attracted the brightest minds from across the galaxy, and its research institutions pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. But lately, that pride had been tempered with unease. The whispers of Xarathosian influence had grown louder, and the silence of the secular political leaders had become deafening. In the halls of government, that silence wasn't an accident. Councilman Ryland sat at his desk, eyes scanning over a series of reports. His office was modest for a man of his stature, but he preferred it that way. He wanted to appear grounded, connected to the people he served. But today, his usual calm had given way to frustration. The unrest was getting worse. The attacks, the protests, the rising tension between secularists and Xarathosians, it was all spiraling out of control. His office door slid open, and one of his aides, a young woman named Halia, stepped inside, her expression tight with concern. "Councilman, we've received another report from the capital. More protests, this time in the business district. Xarathosian groups are demanding more protections, claims of discrimination." Rylan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "And how many people were injured this time?" "3 minor injuries," Halia said, her voice laced with hesitation. "But it's escalating." Rylan nodded. He had seen this coming for months, but every time he had brought it up in the council, every time he had suggested a more decisive stance against Xarathosian extremism, he had been met with silence. Or worse, opposition. "The left-wing parties still won't support any strong action?" Rylan asked, though he already knew the answer. Halia shook her head. "No. In fact, some of the more prominent members are speaking out against even labeling the attacks as extremist. They're framing it as a response to systemic discrimination." Rylan's jaw clenched. "They've infiltrated us." Halia didn't respond immediately, but her silence spoke volumes. They both knew the truth. Xarathosian influence had seeped into the left-wing political parties. Over the past few years, key positions in the party had been quietly filled by Xarathosian sympathizers, individuals who either openly followed the faith or who had financial and political ties to Xarathos-controlled planets. This wasn't just a matter of ideology anymore. It was a matter of power. "Do you want me to draft another statement?" Halia asked. "Something neutral, maybe?" Rylan shook his head. "No, not this time. We can't keep being neutral. If we don't do something soon, Xarathos will fall apart." Halia hesitated. "Councilman, there's something else. It's not just the political influence. It's the resources." Rylan leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharpening. "I know. Xarathos controlled 7 planets, and those planets were rich with resources, rare minerals, energy sources, and advanced materials that Xarathos and other secular planets relied on to keep their societies running. The Xarathos planets weren't technologically advanced like Xarathos. They didn't have the educational systems or the scientific progress of the secular worlds, but they had the raw materials. For years, the secular planets had made quiet deals with the Xarathos-controlled systems. In exchange for lower prices on vital resources, they had allowed Xarathosian immigrants and asylum seekers to preach their beliefs freely on their planets, even when those beliefs conflicted with the core values of the secular societies. The unrest that followed was an unspoken cost of doing business. "It's about the economy, isn't it?" Rylan said bitterly. "They'd rather see our cities burn than pay higher prices for energy." Halia's expression was grim. "Yes, sir. The economy depends on those resources. Xarathos controls the flow, and if we challenge them too strongly, they'll raise the prices, maybe even cut us off. So the council stays quiet, and people like me are told to stand down." Halia nodded, her voice soft. "Exactly." Rylan stared at the reports in front of him, the protests, the violence, the growing influence of Xarathos. Xarathos was a society built on freedom, but that freedom was slowly being undermined by the very ideals it held so dear. Inclusivity had become a weapon, and the council's refusal to act had given Xarathos the foothold it needed. "Meanwhile, the people suffer," Rylan muttered, leaning forward. "And what do? Nothing. We let them preach their violence in our streets, all because we need their minerals to fuel our factories." Not everyone on Xarathos was willing to remain silent, though. The rise of a new political movement had begun to stir the population. Known as the True Secularists, this group rejected both the extreme left's neutrality toward Xarathos and many of the core principles that had defined Xarathos' secular society for decades. They were against Xarathos, but they also opposed the freedoms that had once been held sacred. such as abortion rights and the right to carry weapons. Reyna, one of the movement's leaders, stood before a crowd of supporters in the lower districts of Xarathos, her voice powerful and unwavering. "We can no longer sit idly by while our leaders sell our freedoms for cheaper minerals," she declared, her fist raised. "This is not just about Xarathos. This is about the future of Xarathos. We are sacrificing everything we stand for just to maintain our comfortable lives." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in unison. Reyna's message was a direct challenge to the political establishment. The true secularists believed in protecting Xarathos from Xarathos' influence, but they also believed that secular society had grown too permissive, too indulgent. In their view, Xarathos had become a place where moral relativism had allowed for societal decay. They called for a return to stricter laws and stronger national values. "We must protect our families," Reyna continued, her voice cutting through the air. "We must protect our children from this extremism. Xarathosians bring their war-hungry beliefs to our planet, and what do? We let them preach in our streets. We let them spread their poison through our social media, while our leaders sit in their chambers and count their credits." Darius stood at the edge of the crowd, listening to Reyna's speech with conflicted emotions. She didn't agree with all of the true secularist positions. They were against abortion, for one, and they wanted to repeal laws that had given people the right to bear arms. But on the issue of Xarathos, she found herself aligning with them more and more. The secular political parties had become too complacent, too compromised. "They're going to win more seats in the next election," Tomas whispered beside her. He had been keeping an eye on the movement for months. "People are scared. They want action, and Reyna's promising it." "She's promising a lot of things," Daria muttered. "Not all of them good." Tomas nodded. "No, but people are more willing to sacrifice certain freedoms if they feel like they're under attack. And Xarathos is giving them plenty of reasons to feel like that." Daria crossed her arms, watching as Reyna raised her arms to the crowd. "We've allowed them to take control of our government, our economy, and our streets," Reyna shouted. "But we won't let them take our future. It's time for the true secularists to rise, to take back Xarathos from those who would sell it out." The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers echoing through the streets. Daria felt a knot form in her stomach. The situation on Xarathos was growing more volatile by the day. Between the left-wing parties in action, the influence of Xarathos, and the rise of the true secularists, it was only a matter of time before something snapped. But when it did, which side would Xarathos end up on? In the council chambers, Ryland stared at the screen in front of him. The resources from Xarathos' planets were being delivered on time, as always. The minerals would keep the factories running, keep the hover cars gliding through the air, keep Xarathos' economy afloat. But at what cost? As long as the secular planets needed those resources, Xarathos would have leverage. And the price of that leverage was already being paid in unrest, in violence, in the slow erosion of everything Xarathos had once held dear. Ryland clenched his fists. The future of Xarathos was slipping through their fingers, and he wasn't sure there was anything he could do to stop it. Chapter 6. The Journey to Faith and the Fall into Darkness. Rael stood at the transport dock of Xarathos, his eyes fixed on the massive starship that would take him to the Xarathos-controlled planet of Carvon. The sleek silver hull of the ship reflected the dying light of the sun as it prepared for departure. Behind him, the advanced and open society of Xarathos seemed to fade into the background, while ahead, the promise of a new life under Xarathos beckoned. For months, he had listened to the sermons, followed the teachings, and embraced the certainty of the Xarathosian faith. "This is what I need," Rael whispered to himself. The confusion and purposelessness that had once plagued him on Xarathos would soon be left behind. Xarathos promised order, a clear path, a life where every role was defined, and where he could serve something greater than himself. The sermons on Xarathos had been full of peace, submission, and unity, a life of purpose that secularism couldn't provide. But something nagged at him as he boarded the ship, as though the weight of the decision hung heavier than he had imagined. Yet he had made his choice. The ship's engines roared to life, and within hours, Rael left the only home he had ever known behind. The descent into Carvan's atmosphere was jarring. The once serene vision of a new life slowly began to unravel as the planet came into view. Unlike the advanced cities of Xarathos, Carvan was a stark contrast of sprawling gray cities built in rigid geometric shapes. Enormous statues of Xarathos loomed over every plaza, each one more imposing than the last, their expressions cold and distant. The air was thick with ash from the constant military exercises conducted in the wastelands outside the cities. Rael stepped out into the streets, feeling a sense of disorientation. Where were the peaceful preachers who had spoken of divine unity and order? The air buzzed with something far more oppressive. Soldiers marched in perfect rows down the streets, their faces hard, their eyes blank. Around them, women moved silently, their heads covered, their eyes cast downward, careful not to meet the gaze of any man. He had barely taken a few steps when he was met by a man in a dark robe, one of the city's judicators, the enforcers of Xarathos' laws. The judicator gave Rael a scrutinizing glance. "You're new," the man said coldly, his eyes narrowing. "Follow me." Rael obeyed, a sinking feeling beginning to stir in his gut. They arrived at a barracks-like complex where the judicator led him to a communal hall. It was filled with other converts, people like Rael who had left their secular homes to embrace Xarathos. Some of them seemed as lost as he was, their hopeful expressions dimming under the harsh reality of life on Carvan. The judicator stood at the front of the room, his voice booming with authority. "Welcome to your new life, servants of Xarathos. You have left behind your confused, chaotic lives in the secular world to join the only true path. Here, you will learn the real teachings of Xarathos, the teachings that weak, decadent societies cannot handle." Rael shifted uneasily in his seat. He had heard about the real teachings, the ones that were too strong for the open-minded secularists, but something in the judicator's tone chilled him. "As men, you are the chosen of Xarathos, blessed with the strength to guide the weak and uphold the divine order. You will each be assigned your role in society based on your class and your devotion. Some of you will fight in the holy wars. Others will oversee the labor of the women and the lower classes. But know this, your loyalty is to Xarathos, and your life is for Xarathos." The judicator's eyes passed over the women in the room, a contemptuous sneer on his face. "As for the women," he continued, "they exist to serve. Their thoughts, their bodies, their lives are under the ownership of men, as decreed by the divine law. They are not to speak unless spoken to. They are not to question, for they are weak and must be guided." Rael felt his stomach churn. The preachers on Xarathos had spoken of submission, but they had never mentioned this. They had preached unity and mutual respect within the divine order, but here, women were little more than property. Over the following weeks, Rael saw the reality of Carvan unfold before him. The teachings of Xarathos, as preached on Xarathos, had been a soft version of the truth, designed to attract converts from open societies, to present Xarathos as a path to meaning without revealing the harshness that awaited them on the planets controlled by the faith. Here, the class system was rigid and inescapable. Men of higher class were given multiple wives, concubines, and the power to rule their households with an iron fist. Rael, born into a lower class, was expected to serve those above him without question. He learned that the hierarchies were absolute. Individuality was a sin, and to question the divine order was considered heresy, punishable by severe beatings or worse. He had expected structure and purpose, but he hadn't expected this. In the streets, women moved like shadows, their faces hidden under heavy veils, their movements restricted to designated areas of the city. They were never allowed to walk alone, and Rael had overheard disturbing conversations about how men could punish their wives or concubines for disobedience without repercussion. The preachers on Xarathos had never mentioned the warped patriarchy that permeated every layer of life here. One evening, Rael passed a public square where a group of young boys, barely teenagers, were being led by a priest in a military march. They chanted hymns to Xarathos, praising war and death in the name of the divine, their eyes empty of innocence. It was here that Rael learned another bitter truth. Holy war was the ultimate purpose. The planets under Xarathos' control were always preparing for battle, despite their technological inferiority. Due to strict restrictions on scientific advancement, science was seen as a form of rebellion against the divine order. The society valued martyrdom above all else. Boys were trained to die for Xarathos, and the failure to raise warriors was seen as a failure in devotion. Rael sat in his room that night, staring at the walls that seemed to close in on him. He had traded the freedom of secular life for this world where war was worshipped, where women were slaves, and where individuality was a sin. He remembered the words of the preacher who had converted him back on Xarathos. Here, you will find purpose. Here, you will belong. But the version of Xarathos he had been sold was a lie, crafted to manipulate those who were disillusioned with freedom and choice. The preachers had knowingly hidden the truth. They had softened the edges of their teachings to attract converts, speaking of unity and divine love, while concealing the brutal reality of a society built on oppression, violence, and control. Rael looked out of his window at the cold, unfeeling city. There was no escape. Leaving Xarathos was impossible. Apostasy was punishable by death, and no one was allowed to leave once they had committed their life to the faith. He had willingly walked into this prison, and now there was no way out. In the distance, the sounds of soldiers training for war filled the air. Xarathos was preparing for a conflict they could not win, but it didn't matter. For them, war was a sacred act, and dying for Xarathos was the highest honor. The loss of individual life was meaningless in the grand scheme of the divine order. Rael felt a wave of dread wash over him. The reality of Xarathos was not one of peace and purpose. It was a world of subjugation, violence, and control. He had made the worst mistake of his life, and now there was no way out. The next morning, Rael was summoned to the barracks. His new life under Xarathos had truly begun. Chapter 7. Prison of Faith. Rael woke before the dawn, his body aching from the weeks of physical labor and military drills imposed upon him since his arrival on Karvan. His room was small and sparse, with a thin mattress, a single drawer, and a narrow window that allowed only the faintest hint of light to filter through. It was not a place of comfort, but comfort was a sin here. Comfort led to indulgence, indulgence to rebellion, and rebellion was the ultimate betrayal of Xarathos. The call to prayer echoed through the streets, a long, mournful sound that carried over the city. It was compulsory, prayer at sunrise and sunset, without fail. Rael dragged himself from his bed, dressing quickly in the simple tunic they had provided. The first time he had heard the call to prayer, it had filled him with awe. He had knelt with the other converts, feeling a strange sense of belonging, believing that this act of devotion would give him peace. But now, each prayer felt like chains being pulled tighter around his soul. Rael stepped into the street and joined the line of men walking silently to the great temple. As they approached, the enormous statues of Xarathos towered above them, their eyes carved into stern, omnipotent gazes. The women were already kneeling in a separate section, covered from head to toe, their heads bowed low. The men took their places in the front rows, kneeling in perfect unison, heads bent toward the ground. The judicator at the head of the temple began the prayer, his voice deep and rhythmic. Xarathos, we submit to your will. We, your servants, surrender our bodies, our minds, our souls. Guide us in your divine plan, for our lives are not our own. They belong to you. Rael's lips moved, repeating the words. But inside, he felt nothing. He had once believed these prayers would bring him closer to something greater, but now they only filled him with dread. Every prayer felt like a lie he had to participate in twice a day, every day. When the prayer was over, the men participate in twice a day, every day. When the prayer was over, the men rose in silence and dispersed. The day had begun. For months, Rael endured life on Carvon. The rigid routines, the constant surveillance, the unrelenting propaganda, all of it weighed on him. He had been a cybersecurity expert on Xarathos, working for one of the most advanced tech firms on the planet. Back then, his life had felt chaotic, lacking purpose, and he had longed for something more. Xarathos had seemed like the answer, offering structure and meaning, but now he understood the truth. The version of Xarathos preached on Xarathos had been a deliberate deception, a softened, palatable faith designed to lure the disillusioned. Here, on Carvon, the true face of Xarathos was revealed. Women were property, individuality was a sin, and war was worshipped. Every day the soldiers trained for the inevitable holy war, their chants of martyrdom echoing through the streets. Rael knew there was no way out. Apostasy was punished by death, and anyone who tried to leave Carvon was either executed or vanished without a trace. But Rael couldn't go on living like this, pretending to believe in something that made his stomach churn. His conscience wouldn't allow it. He had to do something. Rael began his rebellion quietly, in the only way he knew how. Each night, after the final prayer at sunset, he returned to his room and began reading the sacred texts of Xarathos. He wasn't reading them for devotion, he was studying them, learning the intricacies of the religion, the contradictions, the oppressive rules that were hidden from the outside world. The more he read, the more the horror of Xarathos' doctrine became clear. The texts glorified male dominance and enshrined the patriarchal class system. Women were described as vessels whose sole purpose was to bear children for the cause. Men were instructed to take multiple wives and concubines, while women were forbidden from holding any power or making any decisions. The text even justified the sexual slavery of women captured in war, framing it as their divine purpose. War was central to the faith. Xarathos preached that the ultimate goal of life was to die in service of the deity, and that victory in war would bring the faithful closer to salvation. Yet, the planet's lack of scientific advancement left it woefully underprepared to fight the secular planets it viewed as enemies. They were trapped in a cycle of preparing for a war they could never win. But that didn't matter to the leaders. They didn't need to win, they only needed martyrs. The more Rael read, the more he realized just how dangerous Xarathos was. And he knew he had to find a way to share this truth with the galaxy. Rael's background in cybersecurity gave him a unique advantage. Though technology on Carvon was restricted, he had managed to secure access to the planet's underground networks, hidden communication channels that were used by rebels, dissidents, and black market traders. It wasn't easy, but he had learned how to bypass the surveillance systems the adjudicators used to monitor the population. Each night, after sunset prayer, Rael sat in front of his terminal, working in secret. His fingers flew across the keys, pulling up encrypted data streams, masking his digital footprints, and hacking into channels that connected to the wider galaxy. He began writing, recording everything he had learned about Xarathos, the oppressive society, the lies preached to secular planets, the harsh realities of life under the faith. He wrote about the subjugation of women, the class system, and the endless preparation for a holy war that was more about control than conquest. He wrote about the way Xarathos twisted people's desires for meaning into a tool for domination. And then, when his reports were ready, he began transmitting them. At first, he sent his messages to underground resistance groups on secular planets, groups that had already begun to resist Xarathos' influence. He knew that if his transmissions were intercepted, he would be executed on the spot. But the risk didn't matter anymore. Rael had long since passed the point of caring about his own safety. He couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. He had made a terrible mistake by coming here, and now he was determined to save others from making the same mistake. One night, after a particularly long session of writing and coding, Rael sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. The latest transmission was complete, sent out into the void of space to anyone who could receive it. He had detailed the horrors he had witnessed on Karvan, the forced marriages, the sexual exploitation of women, the indoctrination of children into a death cult mentality. He had exposed the falsehoods spread by the Xarathosian preachers on secular planets, showing how they deliberately manipulated the teachings to make the faith seem appealing. But he knew it wasn't enough. He had to reach more people. He had to break through the noise of propaganda and expose Xarathos for what it truly was. As Rael sat there, the weight of the task ahead of him pressing down on his shoulders, he heard the faint sound of footsteps outside his door. His heart skipped a beat. He quickly shut down his terminal, his mind racing. Had someone found him out? The door creaked open, and Rael's pulse quickened. But it wasn't a judicator. It was a woman, one of the servants who worked in the barracks. She moved quickly, her eyes darting around the room, her face hidden beneath a veil. She slipped a small piece of paper into his hand before turning and disappearing back into the hallway. Rael unfolded the paper, his hands trembling. "We know what you're doing. We will help you." For the first time in months, Rael allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. Somewhere, there were others who knew the truth, others who wanted to resist the tyranny of Xarathos. He didn't know who they were or what they could do, but he knew one thing for sure. The fight had only just begun. Reflection, Rael now understood that he could never return to his old life on Xarathos, but he could still make a difference. He couldn't stand by and let Xarathos continue to spread its lies to other planets, enslaving minds and bodies. The galaxy needed to know the truth, and as long as Rael was alive, he would keep sharing it, no matter the cost. Every sunrise and every sunset, Rael would join the compulsory prayers, bow his head, and mouth the words. But inside, he was no longer a follower. He was a rebel, and rebels don't submit. Chapter 8, Shadows of Resistance. Rael's heart raced as he held the small slip of paper in his trembling hands. The message was simple, but its implications were enormous. Someone knew what he was doing, and whoever they were offering help. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope cut through the suffocating dread that had hung over him since arriving on Karvan. But the danger was real. If the wrong people found out about his activities, it wouldn't just be him who paid the price. Execution wasn't just a threat here. It was a public spectacle, a reminder to everyone of the cost of disobedience. Rael paced his small room, anxiously waiting for nightfall. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the ever-present eyes of Xarathos seemingly lurking behind every corner. The door creaked open again, and the woman entered, this time without hesitation. She moved with swift precision, closing the door behind her and glancing around to ensure they were alone. "You were easy to track," she said bluntly, pulling back her veil to reveal sharp, intelligent eyes. Her face was tired, but there was a fire behind her gaze, one that Rael recognized immediately. She had been broken down like him, but her spirit was far from defeated. Rael blinked, confused. "Track me? How?" "You're too polite," she cut him off, crossing her arms. "Too kind to women, especially women like me, servants, the lower class. You're cautious, but not cautious enough. In a society like this, any kindness you show is a beacon. It's how I knew you weren't one of them." Her words stung, not because of their harshness, but because of their truth. He had tried to maintain some semblance of his former self, the man he had been on Xarathos, but in Karvan, that man was a target. "For your own safety," she continued, "you need to act like them, be harsher, colder." Zarathosian society feeds on dominance, especially over women and the lower classes. Any deviation, any sign of mercy, will make you stand out. Rael nodded slowly, feeling a pit form in his stomach. The very idea of treating others with cruelty went against everything he believed in. But here, survival depended on blending in. He couldn't afford to be kind, not anymore. "Who are you?" Rael finally asked, his voice quiet. "My name is Lyra," she said, her tone softening slightly. "Like you, I came here willingly. I thought Xarathos would give me purpose. I thought I'd be able to use my skills, my knowledge, to contribute to something greater." Lyra looked away for a moment, her lips tightening into a grim line. "I'm an AI expert, a hacker. Back on Xarathos, I worked with some of the most advanced systems in the galaxy. But here, I'm just a servant. Because of my gender, because of my class, I'm nothing." Rael's eyes widened in recognition. "You're the one who's been hacking the networks here, aren't you?" Lyra nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Yes, and I've been watching you. I had to make sure you weren't some fool who'd get himself caught. But I can see now that you're smart. You just need a bit more guidance." Rael felt a surge of relief. He wasn't alone in this after all. "You said you could help me stay hidden. How?" Lyra moved quickly, her fingers pulling out a small device from her robe. "Social engineering is key here. You need to manipulate the way people see you. Stay rigid in public, give no one reason to doubt your devotion, and avoid unnecessary interactions. I've also modified the surveillance systems. I can't turn them off completely, but I can reroute the footage if you ever need to hide something." Rael watched her work, feeling a flicker of hope. "You've done all of this under their noses?" Lyra looked at him with a sly smile. "They underestimate people like me. A woman, a maid. No one thinks I'm capable of this. But I've been gathering information for months now. And not just about this planet." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "I'm working with the true secularists, with Reyna. We're digging up everything we can on Xarathos' influence on the secular planets, their financial ties, the illegal funding of extremist groups. They're buying influence in the governments, and we're working to expose that." Rael felt his breath catch. He hadn't expected this. "Reyna? She's involved?" Lyra nodded. "Yes, she's leading a movement to stop Xarathos from spreading any further, but we need hard evidence. That's where I come in. We've been tracking the flow of money from Carvan to key groups on Xarathos and other secular planets. It's not just a few donations here and there, it's a full-scale financial operation." Rael could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. They weren't just fighting against an oppressive religion, they were fighting a machine that had infiltrated their societies at the highest levels. "How do we stop them?" Lyra's expression darkened. "We expose them. We show the secular governments the truth, not just about the money, but about the daily atrocities happening here on Carvan." She handed him a small data chip. "This has footage from inside the execution chambers. Every day they execute people, men, women, children. Anyone who steps out of line, anyone who questions the faith. The executions are public, meant to control the population through fear. But they don't let outsiders see this side of Xarathos. They hide it, just like they hide the real teachings." Rael took the chip, his fingers shaking slightly. "And if we can get the other governments?" Lyra nodded. "It'll be harder for them to justify doing business with Xarathos if they know what's really happening here. Reyna's already working on political pressure, but we need something concrete. This," she pointed to the chip, "is that proof." For a moment, Rael was silent, the weight of the task ahead of him pressing down on his shoulders. "And if we get caught?" Lyra's eyes were hard. "Then we die, but we'll die for something worth fighting for. We've both made mistakes coming here, but we have the chance to make it right." Rael's mind raced. He had once thought that embracing Xarathos would bring him peace, but now he understood that peace came at the cost of freedom. And he couldn't stand by and let others fall into the same trap. "I'll do it," he said quietly. I'll help you. Lyra smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Good. But remember, if you want to survive, you need to keep up appearances. You need to act like one of them. Be cruel when you have to be. Show no mercy. Rael nodded, though the thought of it made his stomach churn. I understand. Good. Lyra moved toward the door, pausing for a moment before turning back. You're stronger than you think, Rael, but this won't be easy. As she disappeared into the shadows, Rael sat in the dim light of his room, the data chip clutched in his hand. He had made the mistake of believing in Xarathos once, but now he was committed to exposing the truth, no matter the cost. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Chapter 9. The walls close in. The news came faster than expected. On Xarathos, Reyna had filed the lawsuit, a daring and unprecedented move. Rael and Lyra's stolen information, evidence of daily executions, the oppressive class system, the sexist laws, and most importantly, the financial ties between Carvan and extremist Xarathos groups on secular planets had shaken the very foundations of the government. It wasn't just Reyna and her movement. The secular world had been rocked by the revelations. Rael sat in his cramped room, staring at his terminal, the dim light flickering across his face. He had just finished watching the broadcast from Xarathos, where Reyna had delivered her statement to the Interplanetary Council, denouncing Carvan and the entire Xarathos ideology. The ideology of Xarathos is not just a religion, it is a totalitarian force designed to control, subjugate, and incite violence, Reyna had said, her voice unwavering. The proof is undeniable. Executions, forced marriages, systemic oppression of women, financial corruption, illegal funding of extremist groups across our free planets. And now, they seek to infiltrate our political systems through bribery, illegal trade, and fear. Rael's hands trembled slightly as he replayed her words in his mind. They had done it. The truth was out. But now that it was, the reality of what they had exposed came crashing down on him. Carvan was in chaos. The crackdown had started almost immediately after the lawsuit became public. The leaders of Carvan, enraged by the exposure of their hidden atrocities, responded with brutal force. The judicators, enforcers of Xarathos law, had ramped up their surveillance. Every street corner, every public square, every place that had once seemed safe was now under watchful eyes. Drones hovered over the city, scanning the population with cold, unfeeling precision. Every move Rael made felt like it was being observed, analyzed, scrutinized. The air in Carvan was heavy with fear. Inside his room, Rael paced nervously. Lyra had managed to slip him a message earlier that day. Surveillance is tightening. We're not safe. Not anymore. Rael knew it was true. He had already noticed the increased patrols, the sudden searches of random citizens in the streets, the heightened presence of judicators who seemed to look too long at anyone who didn't conform perfectly to the expected norms of submission and obedience. He had tried to keep up appearances, acting harsher, more detached, colder, just as Lyra had instructed. But each day, it became harder to maintain the facade. Inside, Rael felt his panic growing. He wasn't ready for this. They had done what they set out to do, expose the truth. But now Carvan was hunting for the traitors responsible for the leak. And Rael had no illusions about what would happen if they were caught. Death would be the kindest option. Later that evening, Rael met Lyra in a dimly lit alleyway just behind one of the city's dilapidated factories. She moved quickly, her face hidden by the veil she always wore in public. Her eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of judicators or surveillance drones. When she reached him, her voice was low, tense. "Things are worse than we thought," Lyra said, her tone sharp with urgency. "They're going door to door now. Anyone even suspected of dissent is being arrested and interrogated. And the city is completely locked down. No one gets in or out." Rael swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. How long do you think we have? Lyra shook her head. I don't know. Maybe days, maybe hours. They'll track us down eventually. She pulled a small device from her robes and handed it to him. This is the last of the information we have. The final data we managed to scrape from their systems. It's not just about the executions or the corruption. It's about the technology trades. Illegal weapons, black market biotech, all sent to Xarathosian groups on the secular planets to destabilize them. Rael's eyes widened as he took the device. This could cripple them even more. Lyra nodded. If we can get this to Reyna and her team, it'll prove how deep the corruption runs. But getting it off the planet, that's going to be the hard part. They both knew the truth. Karvan was under total lockdown. Communication lines were monitored, and every data stream leaving the planet was being scanned for anything suspicious. Any attempt to send the information out would likely be detected, and that would mean immediate capture. Rael looked at Lyra, his mind racing. What about us? Even if we get the data out, they'll come for us. Lyra met his gaze, her expression hardening. We'll have to disappear. Change identities. Go underground. There's no other option. For a moment, Rael's mind flashed back to his old life on Serenos, his job, his freedom, the open streets where he could walk without fear of being watched. It all felt like a distant memory now, like a dream he had once lived but could never return to. But he couldn't go back. He had chosen this path, and now there was no way out. Not unless he wanted to live as a coward, hiding from the truth he had worked so hard to expose. The crackdown intensified over the following days. Public executions became more frequent, as the leaders of Karvan sought to instill fear into the population. Each execution was a grim reminder of the absolute power Xarathos held over its followers. Anyone suspected of aiding the secular world, anyone suspected of disloyalty, was dragged into the streets and made an example of. The propaganda machine was in full force now. On every street corner, massive screens broadcast the fury of Karvan's leaders, condemning the secular planets for their disrespect and betrayal. The lawsuit filed by Reyna had been dismissed as a baseless attack on the holy and divine Xarathos, and anyone found to be supporting it was labeled a traitor. But worse, the secular governments had reacted by cutting ties, banning Xarathosian groups, and labeling them as terrorist organizations. The true secularists, led by Reyna, had forced their governments to take action. The money trails that Rael and Lyra had exposed had been shut down. The illegal technology trades had been cut off, and dozens of Xarathosian operatives had been arrested on secular planets. Karvan's influence was crumbling, but in response, they tightened their grip on their own people, using every means possible to root out dissent. Rael could see it all unfolding. The more Karvan lost control on the galactic stage, the harsher the internal repression became. The leaders were preparing for something worse, war perhaps, or total isolation. Either way, escape seemed less and less possible. One evening, as Rael sat alone in his room, Lyra managed to slip in unnoticed. She was more anxious than usual, her movements hurried and her voice barely above a whisper. "They're getting closer," she said, her eyes darting toward the door. "I've overheard some of the judicators talking. They're narrowing down the list of suspects." Rael felt his stomach drop. How long? Days, maybe less. She handed him a small encrypted device. "We have to get the rest of this information out now. They've increased security on all outgoing communications, but there's one last channel I can use. It's risky, but it's our only shot." Rael took the device, his hands trembling. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt crushing. "What happens if we get caught?" Lyra's gaze was steady, but there was an undeniable tension in her voice. "Then we die, publicly." They both knew the cost. Karvan didn't deal with traitors in secret. They made an example out of every dissenter. But the alternative, doing nothing, allowing Carvan to continue its reign of terror, wasn't an option. Rael met her gaze, his voice firm. "We have to take the risk. We can't stop now." Lyra nodded, her expression hardening with determination. Then we moved to night. As the sun set over Carvan, casting long shadows over the city, Rael and Lyra prepared for their most dangerous mission yet. They knew the judicators were closing in, that every step they took was under scrutiny. But they also knew that the truth had to be told. For too long, Carvan had hidden behind a veil of piety, using religion to justify oppression, war, and control. And now, thanks to their work, the galaxy was starting to see Xarathos for what it truly was. The cost of their resistance was high. But Rael knew one thing for certain. He would rather die fighting for the truth than live in submission to a lie. The walls of Carvan were closing in, but the fight was far from over. Chapter 10. The Last Stand of Xara. The planet Carvan had become a fortress. Since the public exposure of Xarathos' brutal regime, the planet had gone into complete isolation. The once secret ties with black market tech traders and underworld networks had all but vanished, except for one. Deep within the restricted airspace above Carvan, a single ship approached under the cover of darkness. Officially, it was registered as a delivery vessel, carrying rare technology to feed the planet's hidden underground market. But unofficially, it was far more than that. Inside the hull of the ship, Reyna's special task force waited silently. Their mission wasn't to deliver illegal tech. They had come to extract Rael and Lyra, the two who had risked their lives to expose the truth about Xarathos. The captain of the task force, Commander Vesa, sat in the cockpit, eyes fixed on the control panel as they descended through Carvan's thick atmosphere. They had one shot at this, and the element of surprise was everything. They had no illusions about the dangers. Carvan was on high alert, its streets crawling with soldiers and judicators who were desperate to root out any signs of rebellion. "We're nearing the drop zone," Vesa said, her voice steady despite the tension filling the cabin. "Everyone knows the plan? Get in, grab the targets, and get out. We don't leave anyone behind." The team nodded in silent agreement. Every second on Carvan was a risk. They knew they couldn't afford to get caught, but what they didn't know was that someone was waiting for them. Xara stood in the shadows of the abandoned warehouse near the landing site, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. As a loyal follower of Xarathos, she had always believed in the divine order, the structure that kept the universe in balance. Women like her had no place in the higher ranks of society, but Xara had defied those expectations. Through cunning, relentless devotion, and her unshakable faith in Xarathos, she had climbed the ranks, carving out a place for herself as one of the elite investigators tasked with rooting out rebellion. She had already identified Lyra and Rael as traitors. She had followed their movements carefully, but they had always slipped through her grasp. Now, however, the game was coming to an end. Xara had received a tip-off. There was a delivery coming in tonight, under the guise of black market tech, and it reeked of a rescue mission. She had positioned her forces carefully, ensuring that no one would escape. Her judicators and soldiers were ready, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "They'll be here soon," Xara muttered to herself, her grip tightening on the blaster at her side. "And when they land, there will be no escape." Her devotion to Xarathos had given her this position of power, and she would not fail. She would bring these traitors to justice, and their deaths would serve as a reminder of the price of rebellion. The ship touched down softly, the landing smooth and silent. Rael and Lyra, hidden in the dark alleyways near the warehouse, watched as the special task force disembarked, moving with practiced precision. They had waited months for this moment, months of hiding, months of fear, but now, escape was finally within reach. Lyra glanced at Rael, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to move fast. They won't give us much time." Rael nodded, gripping the small encrypted device they had spent so long protecting. The data they carried would change everything, if they could just get off this planet alive. As they approached the task force, Commander Vesa spotted them immediately, her hand raised in silent greeting. "Lyra, Rael," she said in a low voice. "We're here to get you out. Let's go, quickly." But before they could reach the safety of the ship, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the air. Xara stepped forward, her soldiers emerging from the shadows with their blasters drawn, the lights glinting off their dark armor. Her eyes, cold and focused, locked onto Rael and Lyra. "You thought you could escape Xarathos?" Xara's voice was sharp, cutting through the night. "You thought you could betray your faith, your people, and just walk away?" Rael's heart pounded in his chest. He had known they wouldn't get away without a fight, but seeing Xara there, leading the charge, was a blow he hadn't expected. He had met her once, long ago, when he had still believed in Xarathos. She had been a loyal follower then, and it seemed her faith had only grown more extreme. "You don't understand," Rael shouted back, his voice trembling but defiant. "Xarathos is a lie. They've twisted everything to control people like you." Xara's expression darkened. "You're the liar. You've brought this corruption to our world, and now you will face the consequences." Without warning, the air exploded into chaos. The Special Task Force moved quickly, firing back at Xara's forces as they rushed to shield Rael and Lyra. Blaster shots lit up the night, the sound of metal clashing with metal ringing out in every direction. The fight was fast and brutal, and within moments, the once quiet warehouse district had become a battleground. Xara moved through the chaos with deadly precision, her eyes never leaving Rael and Lyra. She fired relentlessly, taking down one of the task force soldiers with a clean shot to the chest. She had trained for this her entire life. Her faith in Xarathos gave her strength, and she would not let these traitors escape. But as she moved in for the kill, aiming her blaster directly at Rael, a sudden surge of pain shot through her body. Xara looked down, confusion clouding her vision. Blood poured from a wound in her side, where a blaster shot had pierced through her armor. Lyra stood behind her, her face grim, the blaster still smoking in her hand. Xara's expression flickered with shock, then rage, as she dropped to her knees. "You," Xara whispered, her voice barely audible. "You will never escape Xarathos." Lyra knelt down beside her, her face unreadable. "I escaped the moment I saw the truth." Xara's body slumped forward, her final breath slipping away as the fight around them began to fade. The task force quickly rallied, finishing off the last of Xara's soldiers. Commander Vesa grabbed Rael by the arm, pulling him toward the ship. "We're out of time." "Let's go!" Lyra followed, her heart pounding as they boarded the ship and launched into the night sky. Carvan's forces had been scattered, but they wouldn't stay down for long. They had to escape the planet's atmosphere before reinforcements arrived. As the ship ascended into the dark void of space, Rael collapsed into one of the seats, his chest heaving with exhaustion and relief. Lyra sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly. "We did it," Rael whispered, his voice raw. "We actually did it." Lyra nodded, but her eyes were distant. "We got out," she said softly. "But Carvan won't stop, and neither will Xarathos." Rael looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything they had left behind. Xara was dead, but she had been a symbol of something much larger. Xarathos would not let this escape go unpunished. The fight was far from over. As the stars streaked by outside the window, Rael knew that their journey was only just beginning. They had escaped Carvan, but the battle against Xarathos would continue, both on the secular planets and beyond. For now, though, they had survived. And that was enough. Chapter 11, Xarathos Strikes Back. Xarathos did not tolerate defiance. The escape of Rael and Lyra, the exposure of their corruption, and the secular world's growing resistance had provoked the full fury of Carvan. The leaders of Xarathos had been humiliated on the galactic stage, their influence weakened, their connections severed. But they still had power, power fueled by rage, fanaticism, and the unwavering belief that they were the chosen people. The retaliation came swiftly, calculated to send a message not only to Rael, Lyra, and Reyna, but to every secular planet that dared to challenge Xarathos' divine order. Xarathos didn't strike directly at first. They knew their military was no match for the advanced technology and defenses of the secular planets. Instead, they turned to the tools they had long mastered: covert operations, sabotage, and terror. From the hidden depths of Karvan, a new unit was born, the Hands of Xarathos, an elite group of operatives trained in espionage, cyber warfare, and targeted assassination. Their mission was clear: destroy those who had betrayed Xarathos and bring chaos to the secular worlds. Rael had barely settled into the Resistance headquarters on Serenos when the first attack hit. It came not as a fleet of ships or a squad of soldiers, but as a wave of digital destruction. Cyber attacks flooded the networks of Serenos, shutting down entire sectors of the city, crippling communications, and corrupting government files. Rael, a former cybersecurity expert, immediately recognized the attack's origin. The signatures were unmistakable. Xarathos had learned from his own methods, turning the skills of Lyra and others like her against the very systems that had once protected the secular planets. "They're targeting the infrastructure," Rael said urgently, his hands flying over the console as he worked to restore the firewalls. "It's not just sabotage. They're going after our economy, our communications. They're trying to isolate us." "Just like they did with Karvan," Lyra muttered, her brow furrowed as she scanned the damage. "They'll cripple Serenos from the inside before anyone realizes what's happening." Even more dangerous than the cyber attacks was Xarathos' newfound focus on political subversion. While their funding of extremist groups had been exposed and cut off, Xarathos still had deep connections on many secular planets. Not every leader, not every official, was free from their influence. In the aftermath of the lawsuit, key political figures began to rise, their messages eerily aligned with Xarathosian rhetoric. Calls for greater security, restrictions on freedoms, and the need for order over chaos. Under the guise of protecting their people, these officials subtly echoed Xarathos' ideals, preaching that the freedoms of the secular planets had gone too far and were now a threat to stability. On Serenos, a charismatic politician named Valor began to rise through the ranks. Once considered a moderate voice, Valor now spoke passionately about the need for tighter control over the population, citing the cyber attacks as proof that total freedom was dangerous. His speeches gained traction, and soon he had gathered a large following of citizens who feared that the chaos caused by Xarathos' attacks was the fault of their own society's weaknesses. "They're planting seeds of doubt," Reyna said, her eyes dark as she paced the room. "Xarathos doesn't need to send an army. They're letting fear and uncertainty do the work for them." While political subversion worked to destabilize secular planets from within, Xarathos also struck directly at its enemies in the form of targeted assassinations. The Hands of Xarathos had been dispatched to hunt down and eliminate key figures involved in the resistance. The first to fall was a prominent journalist on Eldara, a secular planet that had been one of the strongest voices in exposing Xarathos' crimes. He had written extensively on the atrocities committed on Karvan and the corruption within secular governments. One evening, as he was leaving his office, a sniper shot ended his life in an instant. His death sent shockwaves across the galaxy, a warning to all those who spoke out. The second target was even closer to home: Commander Vesa, the leader of the special task force that had rescued Rael and Lyra. Vesa had been planning a new operation to strike at Karvan's remaining black market networks, but she never got the chance. Her transport ship was sabotaged mid-flight, crashing into the ocean of a neutral planet. No one survived. "They're hunting us," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with fear. "They're taking out anyone who had a hand in exposing them." Rael clenched his fists, his mind racing. Xarathos wasn't just attacking institutions. They were eliminating people, silencing voices, one by one. Back on Caravan, the humiliation of losing their political influence and key operatives only strengthened the fanatical grip of Xarathos on its people. The High Council of Xarathos declared the entire galaxy to be in a state of holy war, calling on every believer to rise up and purge the unbelievers. The sermons became even more extreme, urging the population to sacrifice everything in service of the divine cause. Inside Caravan, society was preparing itself for war. Factories once used for mundane production were converted to manufacture crude weapons and ships, despite their technological shortcomings. Children were indoctrinated in ever more extreme teachings, trained from a young age to be soldiers, martyrs for the holy cause. The leaders of Xarathos knew they could not defeat the secular planets in open battle, but they believed that if enough martyrs gave their lives, they would be rewarded with divine intervention. Xarathos needed no formal army. They unleashed fanatic small groups of believers who infiltrated secular planets, ready to carry out suicide missions in the name of the Holy War. On Xarathos, an attack occurred in a crowded marketplace, a fanatic detonating a bomb while chanting prayers to Xarathos. Dozens were killed, and the message was clear. The war had come to them. "We are not safe," Rael said grimly as he watched the footage of the attack. "They'll stop at nothing now." Back on Caravan, the High Council of Xarathos, humiliated but undeterred, made a chilling declaration. Xarathos had commanded them to prepare for the final holy war, a war not only against the secular planets, but against the very notion of individual freedom itself. They began stockpiling whatever weapons they could, making deals with other isolated extremist planets. Although they were technologically behind, the ideology of martyrdom drove their efforts. They believed that if enough Xarathosians died gloriously in battle, the tide would turn in their favor. They didn't need to win. They needed to make the cost of war so high that secular planets would buckle under the weight of constant terror. The leaders of Caravan made one thing clear: Xarathos would never be silenced. With each new attack, each new assassination, the resistance became more desperate. Rael and Lyra had returned to Xarathos with a deep understanding of how Xarathos operated, but they were now more vulnerable than ever. Xarathos saw them as key traitors, and Rael knew that they would be at the top of the hands of Xarathos' hit list. "We have to keep pushing," Reyna said, her voice hard as she addressed the group of resistance leaders. "Xarathos is trying to scare us into silence, but we can't let them. We have the truth, and we have to keep exposing them." But Rael knew that it wouldn't be enough to just expose the truth. Xarathos was preparing for war, and the secular planets needed to be ready. "They'll come for us all eventually," Rael said, his voice grim. "The question is, are we prepared to stop them?" The galaxy had been plunged into a new era of conflict. Xarathos' retaliation had been swift, brutal, and methodical. They wouldn't stop until they either regained control or were completely destroyed. And as Rael looked out at the stars, he realized that their fight was no longer just about exposing the truth. It was about survival. Chapter 12. The Price of War. The war had become more than a conflict of ideology. It was now a brutal, relentless battle that consumed entire worlds, drawing everyone, believers, secularists, innocents, into its unforgiving jaws. What had once been a battle of principles had devolved into a nightmarish war of survival. For months, the secular planets had fought to contain Xarathos, but the zealots refused to back down. Suicide attacks had devastated major cities, crippled economies, and killed countless civilians. Every blow against Xarathos seemed to provoke even more extreme retaliation. The secular planets, though more technologically advanced, had underestimated the fanatical will of Xarathos. Martyrdom was their weapon, and they wielded it with devastating precision. Rael had seen the worst of it: the bombs detonating in crowded marketplaces, the targeted killings of key figures, the constant fear that gripped every corner of Xarathos. Reyna had fought hard to keep morale high, but even she couldn't prevent the deep fractures spreading across the secular alliance. As the war dragged on, losses mounted on both sides. Every city, colony, and outpost became a target. Lunar colonies, once peaceful havens for research and development, were now battlegrounds, overrun by Xarathos forces who took hostages, using civilians as shields to regain control of the war they had started. 1. The turning point: desperation breeds cruelty. In the sprawling war room of Xarathos, Reyna stood before a large holographic display, showing the positions of the secular forces and the Xarathos-controlled planets. Her face was worn, dark circles under her eyes betraying months of sleepless nights. "We can't keep fighting them like this," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of leadership. "Their suicide attacks are too unpredictable, and they're using hostages to shield their operations. We're losing ground." Rael, standing beside her, nodded grimly. He had seen the carnage firsthand, the twisted remains of bodies, the broken lives left in the wake of Xarathosian suicide bombers. And yet, the zealots seemed to grow stronger, feeding off the chaos they created. "They're fanatics," Rael muttered. "Every life they take just strengthens their resolve." Reyna turned to the gathered military commanders, her expression unreadable. "We've been hesitant, afraid to show the full extent of what we're capable of. But now we have no choice. We need to send a message, one they can't ignore." The room fell silent as the implications of her words settled in. There had been whispers of using the full might of secular technology, weapons so devastating that they could erase entire planets. But until now, those whispers had been silenced by the hope that the war could end without such extreme measures. Commander Vesa, her face as hard as stone, stepped forward. "There's a target we've identified. One of their smaller planets, Varus used as an industrial hub. It's where they manufacture their weapons, their ships. Cripple that planet and we cripple their war effort." "But Varus," Rael's voice faltered. He knew Varus. It wasn't a military stronghold. It was a worker planet, filled with the lower-class citizens of Xarathos, the very people who had been oppressed by the ruling elite. These people weren't the ones waging war from luxurious bunkers. They were the ones trapped in the machinery of a war they didn't control. Reyna's voice was cold. "We've been pushed to the edge, Rael. If we don't act now, we risk losing everything. If we can show them what we're capable of, maybe they'll stop. Or maybe we'll just become like them," Rael whispered. But his words were lost in the rising tension of the room. 2. The decision. A show of power, the order was given. A fleet of secular warships set off toward Varus, carrying with them the most advanced weaponry ever created. At the heart of the fleet was the Sovereign, a massive ship that held the missile capable of obliterating an entire planet. Inside the Sovereign, Captain Ilana stood before the launch console, her heart heavy with the burden of what she was about to do. The missile had been designed to showcase the full power of secular technology. Its destructive force was beyond anything Xarathos had ever faced. "We have no choice," Ilana whispered to herself as she keyed in the launch codes. "We have to end this." As the missile launched from the Sovereign's bay, streaking through space toward Varus, there was no turning back. The countdown began, and every soldier aboard the ship watched in silence as the missile arced toward its target. The destruction of Varus, Innocence Burns Varus, had been a planet of smoke and industry, its skies filled with the ash of factories that never stopped churning out weapons for Xarathos' holy war. The people there, mostly workers, slaves to the hierarchy, had no idea of the doom that was approaching. They had lived their lives under the iron fist of Xarathos, knowing nothing but the grind of labor and the fear of the ruling elite. When the missile hit, the planet didn't stand a chance. A brilliant flash of light lit up the sky, followed by a shockwave that rippled across the surface, flattening everything in its path. Factories, cities, mountains, All were reduced to ash in an instant. The entire planet was obliterated, its life snuffed out as if it had never existed. On board, the sovereign silence reigned as the destruction unfolded on the display screens. Captain Alana looked away, unable to bear the sight of the innocent lives that had been lost in the blast. Rael, watching from the war room on Xarathos, felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He had known Varys. He had known the people there, the workers who had no choice, the families who had never lifted a weapon in their lives. They weren't the ones fighting us, Rael said quietly, his voice barely audible. Rhaena stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the display. It had to be done, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. 4. The consequences, a hollow victory. The destruction of Varys sent shockwaves across the galaxy. Xarathos had been dealt a devastating blow. Their industrial heart had been obliterated, their supply chains crippled. But the cost had been immense. Millions of innocents had perished, and the surviving leaders of Xarathos, safe in their fortified bunkers on other planets, emerged more furious and fanatical than ever. The secular planets had shown their power, but in doing so, they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The people of Varys, the lower class, the oppressed, had paid the price for a war they hadn't chosen, for decisions made by leaders far removed from the battlefield. And now, the war was no longer just about ideology. It was about revenge. Xarathos, though crippled, would not surrender. They sent a broadcast across the galaxy, declaring that the secular planets were murderers of innocence, that their so-called freedom was built on the ashes of those they had slaughtered. The propaganda worked. Xarathosian believers rallied even more fiercely to the cause, vowing to fight until every secular city lay in ruins. 5. Rael's guilt, the cost of war back on Xarathos. Rael couldn't shake the images of Varys from his mind. He had spent his life fighting against the oppression of Xarathos, but now he had seen what the other side was capable of. The cost of using technology as a weapon, the cost of innocent lives. Lyra, standing beside him in the war room, spoke quietly. "We've become the thing we were fighting." Rael looked at her, his heart heavy with guilt. "They forced our hand," he said, but the words felt hollow. "They did," Lyra agreed. "But that doesn't make it right." Rhaena approached them, her face as hard as stone. "We have to end this. No more half measures, no more mercy." "But at what cost?" Rael asked, his voice breaking. "How many more lives will we take in the name of peace?" Rhaena's eyes were cold. "As many as it takes." 6. The future of the war. A dark road ahead. The war had taken a new, darker turn. The secular planets had shown the full might of their technology, but in doing so, they had unleashed a cycle of vengeance that would be impossible to stop. Xarathos was wounded, but far from defeated, and their fanatical leaders now had even more fuel for their holy war. The galaxy teetered on the edge of destruction, and Rael knew that the worst was yet to come. Because in war, there are no true victors, only survivors, and the ghosts of those who paid the ultimate price. Chapter 13. The Wrath of Xarathos. The destruction of Varys had sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. For Xarathos, it wasn't just a strategic loss, it was a deeply personal affront. The planet had been an industrial hub, essential to their war effort, but it was also home to millions of innocent workers. When the Secular Alliance launched the missile that obliterated Varys, it was as if they had lit a match to a powder keg of fanatic rage. Now, the leaders of Xarathos were no longer focused on winning the war. Victory was irrelevant. What mattered now was vengeance. Their goal was simple: to strike at the heart of the secular planets, to cause destruction and death so profound that their enemies would be forever scarred by it. To die in the name of Xarathos, to achieve martyrdom, was now the highest honor, a jewel that shines eternally in the afterlife. The High Council of Xarathos gathered in a hidden war chamber, their faces etched with anger and purpose. At the center of the room stood High Executor Vornis, his voice steady but filled with seething fury. They have shown us their strength by wiping out Varus. But strength without faith is hollow. They think they've won a victory, but they've only created martyrs. Now, we show them the true meaning of devotion. Around the room, the other elite leaders of Xarathos nodded in grim agreement. They knew they couldn't match the technological superiority of the secular planets, but they didn't need to. Fanaticism, hatred, and the desire for revenge would be their weapons now. Their technology won't save them from the righteous, Bornus continued. We'll strike at the heart of their arrogance, and when we do, they will know that no one is safe from Xarathos. 1. A new target, the defenseless secular planet. Xarathos' leaders knew that the biggest secular planets were heavily defended. Striking directly at the heart of Serenos or the capital worlds would be suicide with little payoff. But there was another target, one that symbolized everything the secular alliance stood for, Ithara, a peaceful planet that had long opposed the war. Ithara was the largest planet in the secular union, but it was known for its inclusivity, tolerance, and opposition to violence. While many planets had agreed to engage in the war effort, Ithara had tried to stop the attack on Varus, and had even filed a petition to leave the secular union over the decision. Its people despised conflict and had devoted themselves to diplomacy and peace. They had next to no military defenses, believing that their neutrality would protect them. Xarathos saw this as an opportunity. By attacking Ithara, they wouldn't just destroy a planet, they would destroy a symbol of the secular alliance's inclusivity and tolerance. We don't need to destroy their fleets or their weapons, Vornis said, addressing the elite council. We need to destroy their spirit. Ithara will be our battleground. We'll remind them that even the peaceful are not safe from the righteous. 2. The attack on Ithra. Martyrdom at any cost. Xarathos deployed everything they had left. A massive fleet, composed of their best warships, suicide bombers, and fanatical ground forces, launched toward Ithara with one goal: total destruction. The mission wasn't to capture the planet or secure any strategic advantage. It was to cause as much chaos, death, and terror as possible. For the fighters of Xarathos, this was the ultimate mission. Martyrdom awaited them, and they embraced it without fear. They knew that they might not return from this mission, but they also believed that dying in service of Xarathos was the greatest reward they could achieve. As they approached Ithara, the secular planets received intelligence reports about the fleet. The military councils of Serenos and the other core planets looked over the data, but most of them dismissed it. An attack on Ithara? What would they gain? One general said, shaking his head. There's no strategic value in attacking a peaceful planet. This is desperation. They're trying to scare us, another commander added. It's a terror tactic, nothing more. But they were wrong. What Xarathos lacked in military advantage, they made up for in sheer fanaticism and hatred. The goal wasn't to win ground. It was to show the secular alliance that no one was safe. The devastation of Ithara. By the time the secular forces realized the scale of the attack, it was too late. Ithara, with its minimal defenses, was overwhelmed in mere hours. The Xarathosian fleet descended upon the planet, unleashing a wave of destruction unlike anything the secular alliance had anticipated. Warships bombarded the planet's cities, reducing them to rubble. Suicide bombers landed on the surface, detonating themselves in densely populated areas, taking out schools, hospitals, and places of worship. Ithara's peaceful population had no way to defend themselves. They had been diplomats, artists, teachers, people who believed that dialogue, not violence, could solve the galaxy's problems. Rael sat in the command center on Serenos, staring in disbelief at the reports flooding in from Ithara. His heart sank as he listened to the desperate pleas for help, the frantic reports of civilians being massacred in the streets. They're slaughtering them, Rael whispered, his hand shaking. These people, they didn't even want to be part of the war. When the secular fleets finally arrived at Ithara, it was too late. The once vibrant planet lay in ruins, Xarathos had achieved its goal, not by winning a battle, but by breaking the spirit of the secular planets. 4. The aftermath, broken spirits. Ithara's destruction sent shockwaves across the galaxy. The secular planets, once confident in their technological superiority, were now forced to confront the brutality of fanaticism. Xarathos had nothing left to lose, and that made them more dangerous than ever. On Serenos, Reyna stood before a gathering of military leaders, her face grim. The destruction of Varus had been a calculated move, an effort to cripple Xarathos' war machine, but it had backfired in the worst way possible. Now, the secular alliance was facing a new kind of enemy, one that didn't care about victory, only destruction. "They've shown us their true face," Reyna said quietly. "This isn't a war for resources or power anymore. This is a war of survival, and if we don't, Ithara won't be the last planet to fall." 5. The horrors of fanaticism, reflections. In the days following the attack, Rael and Lyra found themselves grappling with the moral cost of the war. Xarathos' brutality was beyond anything they had imagined, but the secular planets weren't innocent either. "They called us murderers for what we did to Varus," Rael said, his voice heavy with guilt. "And now they've become murderers themselves. What's the difference between us?" Lyra sat beside him, her face etched with sorrow. "The difference is that we still have a choice. They don't care if they live or die. They've lost everything, and now all they want is to take us down with them." The destruction of Ithara wasn't just a blow to the secular alliance, it was a wake-up call. The secular planets had relied on their technology and superior firepower, but they had underestimated the power of fanaticism, the willingness of Xarathos to die for their cause. Now, they were faced with the grim reality that there were no easy victories in this war. As Rael and Lyra watched the footage of Ithara's devastated cities, they knew that the war had reached a point of no return. The lines between good and evil, between right and wrong, had blurred, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Chapter 14. Shadows of Despair. The war had taken its toll on both sides. After the brutal destruction of Varus, the retaliation on Ithara had shattered any illusions of morality. The horror wrought by Xarathos on Ithara was beyond comprehension, and the secular alliance was left to grapple with the devastating consequences. On the bridge of the flagship Resolute, Commander Vesa studied the map of the galaxy, showing the position of the remaining 6 Xarathos-controlled planets. The fleet had been divided. Half of the ships were stationed across the remaining secular planets, protecting them from further attacks, while the other half prepared for an offensive, waiting for the final command. But the question that haunted Vesa and the rest of the alliance was simple. What's next? In the war rooms of the secular planets, leaders and strategists argued over the next steps. Destroying Varus had been a calculated move, a show of power meant to cripple Xarathos' war effort. But instead of ending the war, it had fueled fanatical rage. Now, with the destruction of Ithara fresh in their minds, the secular planets were contemplating a final decisive strike. 1. The divided secular fleet, preparing for war, half of the secular fleet remained on standby, stationed around key planets like Serenos and Eldera, ready to defend against any further suicide attacks from Xarathos. The memory of Ithara's destruction had shaken the Alliance's confidence. No planet was safe anymore. Rael stood in the command center, his gaze focused on the latest intelligence reports. Xarathos was regrouping, and there were whispers of a new target. The fanatics had struck Ithara with brutal efficiency, and now they were looking for their next prize. "They're going to hit us again," Rael muttered to Lyra, who stood beside him. "But this time, we'll be ready." "Ready to do what?" Lyra's voice was bitter. "Ready to watch another planet fall? Or ready to strike back and end them all?" Rael was silent. The question hung in the air like a heavy fog. The secular fleet could easily obliterate the remaining 6 Xarathos-controlled planets, just as they had done to Varus. But at what cost? They had seen the backlash from the destruction of Varus. It hadn't ended the war, it had made it even more brutal. "We're losing ourselves," Rael whispered. "If we wipe them all out, we'll be no better than they are." Lyra's eyes darkened. "And if we don't, they'll keep coming. They'll burn every planet in the galaxy to the ground, just like they did to Ithara." 2. The horror on Ithara. The first responding fleets arrived on Ithara days after the attack, but it was too late to save the planet. The once peaceful world was now a charred wasteland of broken buildings and scorched earth. Smoke still rose from the ruins of its cities, and the bodies of the dead lay strewn across the landscape like broken dolls. The air was thick with the stench of death and fire. Soldiers and medics moved cautiously through the rubble, searching for survivors. What they found was worse than they could have imagined. In the main square of the capital city, a mass grave had been dug. Burned and mutilated bodies were piled high, a grotesque monument to Xarathos' fanaticism. Civilians who had once lived in peace, people who had never lifted a weapon in their lives, had been slaughtered without mercy. "Dear God," one of the soldiers whispered as he stepped into the square, his voice trembling. "What? What did they do?" Medics began pulling the bodies out of the pile, their faces pale with horror. The victims had been cut, burned, and violated in ways that defied comprehension. The soldiers who had arrived expecting a battleground instead found a massacre. It was clear that the attack on Ithara hadn't just been an act of war. It had been a calculated display of brutality, a warning to the rest of the secular planets. But the worst was yet to come. As they moved deeper into the city, the soldiers discovered that many civilians had been kidnapped during the attack. Survivors who had managed to escape the carnage spoke of how Xarathos forces had rounded up entire families, taking them as war bounties. The survivors were broken, their hope extinguished. "They took my family," one woman sobbed as she clung to a soldier's arm. "They took my husband, my children. I begged them not to, but they said it was the will of Xarathos." Rael and Lyra arrived on Ithara shortly after the first responders. As they walked through the ruins, Rael felt his stomach churn. He had seen violence before, but nothing like this. "It's worse than Varus," Lyra said, her voice hollow. This was intentional." Rael knelt beside the bodies, his hands trembling as he touched the cold, lifeless hands of the victims. "They weren't just trying to win a war," he said quietly. "They were trying to break us." 3. Xarathos' next move. A war of attrition back on Karvan. The High Council of Xarathos gathered to discuss their next target. They knew they were outmatched technologically, but they didn't care. Martyrdom was the only goal now. The destruction of Varus had turned every battle into a fight for survival, not just for their planets, but for their beliefs. "We've struck at their heart once," High Executive Vornis said, his voice cold and determined. "Now we strike again. It doesn't matter if we win or lose. What matters is that they fear us." The council agreed. Their strategy wasn't about gaining territory or resources anymore. It was about turning every planet into another Ithara, another symbol of terror. Their next target wasn't chosen for strategic value, it was chosen for maximum destruction. "They're already divided," one council member noted. "Their fleet is scattered. If we can strike quickly, we can cripple another planet." Vornis smiled darkly. "Then we will bleed them, one planet at a time." 4. The Secular Alliance contemplates total destruction. As the intelligence reports from Ithara flooded in, the leaders of the secular planets met in emergency sessions to decide the future of the war. The destruction of Varus had been a turning point, but Ithara's massacre was a wound that would never heal. "We have the power to end this," one general said, his voice filled with anger. "We wipe out the remaining 6 planets, and Xarathos will have nothing left. No ships, no soldiers, no industry." "But that's not true," another voice countered. "They'll still have their fanatics. Even if we destroy every planet they control, the survivors will spread out, and the war will never end." We'll be fighting terrorists and martyrs for centuries. Reyna, who had been sitting quietly at the head of the table, finally spoke. If we destroy those 6 planets, we'll be responsible for the deaths of billions. Not just soldiers, but civilians. People who have no part in this war. We'll be giving Xarathos exactly what they want. They want to turn this into a war of extinction, where there's no turning back. So what do? One of the admirals asked. Do we sit back and let them strike again? Reyna shook her head. No. We find another way. A way to stop this without becoming the monsters they think we are. Rael, listening from the corner of the room, felt a heavy sense of dread. They were running out of time. Xarathos would strike again, and the next time, they might not be able to stop it. But Reyna was right. If they turned the war into one of total annihilation, there would be no winners, only survivors, haunted by the destruction they had caused. Chapter 14 continued, a fight for the soul of the galaxy. The next strike from Xarathos was coming, and it would be brutal. But the secular planets had to decide whether they would respond with vengeance or justice. Because, in the end, the war wasn't just about the survival of worlds. It was about the soul of the galaxy. Reyna stood up from the table, her decision made. We won't annihilate the 6 planets, she declared, her voice firm. We can't let this war become about extermination. If we destroy them all, we become no different from Xarathos. But we won't sit idle either. We'll launch precision strikes. We'll target their leaders, their military, and cripple their ability to strike again. But we will not wipe out billions of innocent lives. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Some of the military leaders shifted uneasily, unsure if Reyna's plan would be enough to stop the fanatics. But deep down, they knew she was right. We'll also mobilize every resource to protect the remaining secular planets, Reyna continued. We won't allow another Ithara. We'll tighten our defenses, and if Xarathos strikes again, we'll be ready. Rael felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this war was far from over. Lyra squeezed his hand gently. We'll find a way through this, she said quietly. We have to. 6. Xarathos' last gambit on Carvon. The High Council of Xarathos had already begun preparations for their next attack. They knew that their military resources were dwindling, and they would never match the secular planets in firepower or technology. But that didn't matter. What mattered was fear. Their next target would be a planet of great symbolic importance, one that had been vocal in its support for peace and tolerance. They would launch their best warships, carrying with them suicide forces who were ready to die in the name of Xarathos. The goal wasn't just to cause destruction, but to break the will of the secular alliance, to show them that no matter how strong their defenses, they could never be safe. We'll bring terror to their doorstep, High Executive Vornis said to the council. They think they can protect themselves. We'll show them the price of their arrogance. The council members nodded in agreement. The next battle would be the most devastating yet. Martyrdom was the path to eternal glory, and they would die as heroes for the cause. 7. The cost of war, hope, and despair. The first responders on Ithara continued their grim work, pulling bodies from the rubble, tending to the wounded, and searching for any sign of the kidnapped. The once vibrant planet was now a shell of its former self, a haunting reminder of the brutality of fanaticism. Rael and Lyra walked among the survivors, speaking with those who had lost everything. The people of Ithara were broken, their faith in peace and tolerance shattered by the violence they had endured. Many had lost family members, kidnapped as war trophies by Xarathos soldiers. One survivor, an elderly man who had lost his entire family in the attack, looked up at Rael with hollow eyes. "We thought we could stay out of this war," he whispered. "We thought if we stayed peaceful, they'd leave us alone. But they took everything." Rael knelt beside the man, his heart heavy with guilt. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "We should have protected you." The man shook his head slowly. "It's not your fault. It's them. They want to destroy everything that's good." Rael stood, watching as the medics worked tirelessly to save those who could still be saved. But the survivors' hope had died along with their loved ones. Ithara would never be the same 8. The fight ahead as the secular alliance regrouped, Reyna began coordinating the next phase of the war. The decision had been made, targeted strikes, not total annihilation. But she knew that Xarathos wouldn't stop. They would keep coming, fueled by their desire for martyrdom and vengeance. "We need to find their leaders," Reyna said, addressing her top commanders. "We cut off the head of the snake and the rest will fall apart." Rael and Lyra stood by her side, ready for the next battle. They knew that they couldn't afford another Ithara. The war had already claimed too many innocent lives, and the soul of the galaxy hung in the balance. But as they prepared for the next strike, Rael couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something even darker. The war had already shown them the brutality of both sides, the fanatical zeal of Xarathos and the devastating power of secular technology. The next battle would decide more than just the outcome of the war. It would determine whether the galaxy could still be saved, or whether it would be consumed by hatred, fear, and violence. "We'll stop them," Lyra said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Rael nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "We have to." As they left the war room, preparing for the next phase of the fight, Rael couldn't help but wonder if, in the end, there would be anything left worth saving. Chapter 15. Through Their Eyes. The galaxy was at a breaking point. After the massacre on Ithara and the annihilation of Varus, the secular planets could no longer afford to be reactive. They had learned one hard lesson: Xarathos would stop at nothing. Now, the secular alliance prepared to intercept the Xarathos fleet before it could destroy yet another planet. But on both sides of the war, people were beginning to realize that the fight was taking on a life of its own, an endless cycle of violence that was devouring everything in its path. 1. Through the eyes of Lieutenant Kalen, secular forces. Lieutenant Kalen sat in the cockpit of his fighter, the hum of the engines vibrating beneath him as his squadron closed in on the Xarathos fleet. The stars stretched out before him, cold and indifferent, as they always had been. But today, they felt more distant. Kalen tightened his grip on the controls. They had received intelligence about the Xarathos strike hours ago, fanatical forces on their way to obliterate another secular world. This time, though, they wouldn't arrive at their destination. The secular fleets were ready. Kalen's squadron had been deployed for a preemptive strike, an aerial ambush that would stop the Xarathos forces in their tracks before they could rain destruction on another innocent planet. "All units, prepare for engagement," the voice of Commander Vesa crackled over the comms. "We take them out now, or they take another world." Kalen's heart pounded. He had seen what Xarathos had done to Ithara. The thought of arriving too late again, of seeing another world burned to ashes, weighed heavily on him. But this time would be different. They would stop them here. "Copy that, Commander," Kalen said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. He had to believe they would succeed. There was no other option. Through the viewport, Kalen saw the dark shapes of the Xarathos warships growing larger as his squadron closed the distance. The enemy ships were crude compared to the sleek designs of the secular fleet, but they were fast and well-armed. And they carried with them the most dangerous weapon of all, fanaticism. "Engage on my mark," Vesa ordered. "We take out their command ships first." Kalen's pulse quickened. He lined up his targeting system, locking onto one of the larger Xarathos warships. It would be a fight to the death. Xarathos forces rarely retreated, preferring martyrdom to defeat. He took a deep breath and waited for the signal. Now! The stars lit up as the first wave of missiles and plasma rounds slammed into the Xarathos fleet. Kalen fired his own missiles, watching as they streaked toward the enemy ships. The explosions that followed were brilliant, but brief. As the secular forces made their assault, Xarathos ships began to break formation. But they didn't retreat. They charged headlong into the fight, launching suicide drones, and returned fire with reckless abandon. "They're not trying to win," Kalen muttered under his breath. "They're just trying to cause as much damage as possible." "Stay focused, Lieutenant." Commander Vasa's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "We need to cripple their leadership. Take out the command vessels, and the rest will fall apart." Kalen steeled himself as he dove toward the largest Xarathos ship, the one believed to be carrying several high-ranking elite members. He fired again, watching as his missiles tore into the hull, sending debris spiraling into space. But something felt wrong. Even as he and the other pilots destroyed ship after ship, he knew the Xarathos forces wouldn't stop. Even after this battle, another leader would rise, another fleet would gather. This war had become something beyond reason, a war of endless death and renewal. 2. Through the eyes of Mara's Xarathos forces, Mara stood in the cramped war room of the Xarathos flagship, her eyes trained on the swirling holographic map of the battle unfolding outside. She had always known this day would come, the day she would lay down her life for Xarathos, the day she would be honored as a martyr for the cause. She was not afraid. Fear was for the faithless. The ship rattled violently as another barrage of missiles from the secular fleet struck the hull. Around her, the commanders barked orders, their voices tinged with desperation. But desperation wasn't part of the plan. They had known the risks when they set out on this mission. They were never meant to survive. Mara glanced at her superior, high executor Vornis, who stood at the head of the war room. His face was grim, but there was a fire in his eyes. He had led them into this battle knowing that the secular forces would try to stop them. And he had accepted it. "Don't falter," Vornis said to the room. "Their strength is nothing compared to our faith." Mara nodded in silent agreement. She had seen how the secular planets had reacted to the destruction of Ithara. They had been horrified, shaken to their core. They had no understanding of the beauty of martyrdom, the eternal reward that awaited those who gave their lives for Xarathos. A nearby officer shouted over the noise. "The main fleet is breaking. We've lost half of our command ships." Vornis didn't flinch. "It doesn't matter. Continue the assault. We are not here to win the battle. We are here to make them bleed." Mara's heart surged with pride. This wasn't about tactics or strategy. This was about sacrifice. Even if they died today, their deaths would inspire countless others. Faith was their weapon, and it was far more powerful than any technology the secularists could muster. Another explosion rocked the ship, and Mara braced herself against the wall as the lights flickered. She could hear the sounds of destruction all around her. The secular forces were closing in, their strikes becoming more precise, more devastating. But she smiled. Every hit they took, every ship that was destroyed, only strengthened the resolve of those still fighting. "Executor Vornis," one of the officers said urgently. "The fleet. It's almost GG1. Vornis glanced at Mara, then back to the officer. "Then we die as martyrs, and when we fall, another will rise to take our place." Mara felt her chest swell with pride. She would die for Xarathos, and her death would be a shining jewel in the crown of martyrdom. She looked out at the battlefield, seeing the secular ships swarming over what remained of their fleet. The end was near, but the fight was far from over. "Ready the escape pods," Vornis ordered calmly. "The next phase of the plan will be executed by those who follow us. We will not be the last to strike." Mara nodded as the final wave of explosions rocked the ship. The lights flickered, then died completely. The ship was failing, but she wasn't afraid. She was ready. 3. The consequences. 1 head cut. Another grows. The secular fleet succeeded in stopping the Xarathos attack. But as Kalen and the rest of the pilots returned to base, there was no celebration. They had destroyed the Xarathos fleet, taken out several elite commanders, and prevented another massacre. But the victory was hollow. As Commander Vasa debriefed her team, the mood was somber. "We cut off the head," she said quietly, "but they'll just grow another. Every time we kill one of their leaders, another fanatic takes their place. Kalen sat back, staring at the star charts on the wall. The war was no longer about who had more ships or better weapons. It was a battle of endurance, of fanaticism versus survival. And no matter how many ships they destroyed, no matter how many battles they won, the fight would never end. Not until something deeper changed. "Maybe we can win the war," Kalen muttered under his breath. "But can we ever win the peace?" Lyra overheard him and sighed. "Not if we keep fighting them the way we have been. We need to find a way to end this without becoming monsters ourselves." But how? With every strike against Xarathos, the secular planets faced the growing realization that they were feeding the cycle of violence. And with every head they cut off, another fanatic rose to replace it. As the galaxy continued to bleed, both sides found themselves trapped in a war they could neither win nor escape. Chapter: The Final Offensive. The secular alliance had reached a tipping point. After years of fighting, failed negotiations, and devastating losses, the leaders of the secular planets finally came to a conclusion: Xarathos would never stop unless they were crushed completely. The attacks, the martyrdoms, the fanaticism, it had all driven the galaxy to the brink of destruction. And now, the secular forces had to make the hardest decision of the war. No more defensive strikes, no more waiting. The time had come for a full-scale offensive. The plan was as brutal as it was ambitious: a simultaneous assault on all 6 remaining Xarathos-controlled planets. The objective was clear: eliminate their space fleets, neutralize their military, crush their political and religious leadership, and take control of the planets. For those colonies that could not be controlled directly, the secular forces would destabilize them from within, funding opposition movements and creating chaos that would keep the remnants of Xarathos' influence locked in a cycle of internal conflict. It was a plan that would take time and hope. 1. The decision to strike. In the war room on Serenos, Reyna stood at the center of a holographic map, her face set in a grim expression as she surveyed the 6 planets that lay before her. Around her, military leaders and political advisors debated the details of the plan, but the decision had already been made. "We've tried to contain them," Reyna said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of responsibility. "We've defended our worlds, destroyed their fleets, and yet they continue to fight. Xarathos feeds off chaos, and every time we cut off one head, another rises in its place." The room was silent, save for the hum of the holographic display. The map showed the 6 remaining Xarathos planets, each a bastion of theocratic rule, each protected by a fleet that had been rebuilt again and again after every defeat. "This ends now," Reyna continued. "We take the fight to them, no more waiting, no more defending. We launch a simultaneous strike on all 6 planets, destroy their fleets, and take control. If we don't, they'll keep coming, and more innocent lives will be lost." One of the generals, a hardened veteran of the conflict, nodded in agreement. "We have the forces to do it. If we strike hard and fast, we can eliminate their fleets before they have time to regroup." "And once we control the planets?" another advisor asked. "What we do then? Their people are loyal to Xarathos. They won't just surrender." "We'll hold the planets," Reyna replied. "We'll dismantle their military, religious, and political structures. We'll root out the fanatics and replace their leaders. And in the colonies or regions we can't control, we'll fund their opposition, destabilize them from the inside." There was a murmur of agreement, but Rael, standing in the shadows of the room, felt a deep sense of unease. The plan was necessary, he knew that. But it was also brutal. Xarathos had to be stopped, but at what cost? Lyra stood beside him, her face unreadable. "This is the only way, Rael," she said quietly. "If we don't do this, the war will never end." Rael nodded, though the weight of the decision pressed heavily on his conscience. "I know, but I can't help wondering what happens after we win. What kind of galaxy will we be left with?" Lyra didn't have an answer. Neither did anyone else. 2. The assault begins. The fleets of the secular alliance moved with precision and overwhelming force. From the shipyards of Xarathos, Eldara, and other major secular worlds, warships launched in a coordinated strike, each fleet assigned to one of the 6 Xarathos-controlled planets. The goal was simple: destroy the space fleets defending the planets, then move in for a ground invasion. Commander Vesa led the strike on Caravan, the heart of Xarathos' empire. As the flagship Resolute emerged from hyperspace, the entire crew braced for the battle that awaited them. The Xarathos fleet, though outnumbered and outgunned, was ready for the fight. But this time, the secular forces wouldn't be caught off guard. "This is it," Vesa said, her voice crackling over the comms. "We take out their fleet, and we take their world. No mercy, no hesitation." Lieutenant Kalen gripped the controls of his fighter, his heart pounding in his chest. He had fought in countless battles, but this one was different. This was the final push, the battle that would decide the future of the galaxy. As the secular fleet descended upon Caravan, missiles streaked through the stars, lighting up the darkness with explosions of fire and debris. The Xarathos warships fought back with everything they had, but they were no match for the combined firepower of the secular alliance. Ship after ship was destroyed, until the space around Caravan was filled with the wreckage of what had once been a proud fleet. "They're breaking!" Vesa shouted as the remaining Xarathos ships attempted to retreat. "Press the attack!" Kalen followed the order, his fighter weaving through the debris as he targeted the last of the fleeing ships. There would be no escape. Xarathos would not survive this day. 3. The ground invasion. With the space fleets decimated, the secular forces moved in to begin the ground invasions. On each of the 6 planets, drop ships descended from the sky, carrying soldiers ready to take control of key cities, military installations, and religious strongholds. Rael was among them, his boots hitting the ground on Caravan as the drop ships touched down on the outskirts of the capital. The air was thick with tension as the secular forces spread out, moving through the streets toward the temples and military compounds that had long served as the center of Xarathos' power. "This is it," Rael said quietly to Lyra as they moved through the ruins of the city. "The heart of their empire." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the streets for any signs of resistance. "We take down their leaders, and this whole thing ends." But the battle wasn't over yet. As the secular forces advanced, they encountered fanatical resistance. Xarathos soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. They had been raised to believe that dying for Xarathos was the ultimate glory, and they threw themselves into the fight with reckless abandon. Rael watched in horror as waves of Xarathos soldiers charged at them, screaming prayers to Xarathos as they detonated explosives strapped to their chests. The suicide attacks were relentless, forcing the secular forces to pull back and regroup. "This isn't going to be easy," Lyra muttered as she fired her weapon at an advancing soldier. "They're not going to surrender." Rael nodded grimly. "We're not just fighting soldiers, we're fighting an entire belief system." 4. Cutting off the heads of power. As the ground battles raged on, the secular forces moved to eliminate the political and religious leaders of Xarathos. Airstrikes targeted key locations, taking out several high-ranking members of the Xarathos elite. The High Council of Xarathos, once the driving force behind the war, was now in disarray. One by one, their leaders fell, taken out by precision strikes or captured in the chaos of battle. But as one leader fell, another rose to take their place. Rael and Lyra stormed the central temple, where the remaining members of the council were holed up. As they breached the doors, they were met with fierce resistance from the last of Xarathos' religious zealots. The fighting was brutal, but the secular forces were determined. Inside the temple, Rael came face to face with one of the last remaining high executors of Xarathos. The man, dressed in elaborate robes, sneered at Rael as he raised his weapon. "You think killing me will stop this?" The executor spat. You think you can destroy Xarathos by force? We are eternal. For every one of us you kill, another will rise. You will never defeat us. Rael raised his weapon, his hands steady. Your time is over. The shot rang out and the executor fell to the ground, lifeless. But even as Rael stood over the body, he knew the executor's words held some truth. Fanaticism couldn't be destroyed by bullets. This war was far from over. 5. The aftermath, a galaxy in chaos with the secular forces in control of the 6 Xarathos planets. The war had reached a turning point. But the victory was far from clean. The remaining colonies and outposts loyal to Xarathos continued to resist, clinging to their belief that their martyrdom would bring eternal glory. In the sectors where direct control was impossible, the secular forces began to fund opposition groups, setting the stage for long-term instability. The plan was simple. If they couldn't maintain direct control, they would make sure the colonies remained locked in internal conflict, unable to rebuild the Xarathos Empire. The galaxy was in chaos. The secular leaders knew this was not a quick victory. There would be years of occupation, years of rebuilding, and perhaps generations before peace would be restored. Every major city on the Xarathos planets was now under secular military control, but the hearts and minds of the people were far from conquered. Religious zealots remained hidden in underground networks, waiting for the chance to strike back. Rael stood on the smoldering ruins of what had once been the central temple of Xarathos on Karvan, the heart of the theocratic empire. The secular banners now flew over the shattered city, but the air still felt heavy with defiance. Around him, soldiers moved through the streets, securing areas, rounding up prisoners, and searching for any remaining resistance. Lyra approached him, her face drawn with exhaustion. It's done. We've taken all 6 planets. The High Council is either dead or captured, and the fleet is destroyed. Rael nodded, but his expression remained somber. It's not really done, though, is it? The leaders may be gone, but the belief remains. The people, they still believe in Xarathos. They'll keep fighting. Lyra sighed, glancing at the soldiers rounding up Xarathos loyalists nearby. Maybe, but without their leaders, they're disorganized. And without their fleet, they can't launch any more attacks on us. We've broken their back. But the war of ideas isn't over, Rael said quietly. You can't kill an idea with bullets and bombs. We'll be dealing with insurgencies and fanatics for decades, maybe even longer. Lyra looked out at the desolate city, her shoulders slumping. So we won the war, but lost the peace. 6. Uncertain peace. The secular alliance had achieved its goal, the destruction of Xarathos' military and political structure. The 6 planets that had once been under theocratic rule were now occupied by secular forces, and military governors were appointed to oversee the rebuilding process. But peace was fragile, and resistance simmered beneath the surface. Reyna, now one of the key architects of the post-war strategy, stood in the newly established command center on Xarathos. Reports from the occupied planets were coming in daily. Uprisings, sabotage, and assassination attempts were becoming routine. They're not giving up, one of her advisors said, shaking his head. Even with their leadership gone, they're still fighting in the streets. They're using guerrilla tactics, hitting our soldiers and fading back into the population. Reyna nodded, her face hard. It was expected. We're dealing with generations of indoctrination. Xarathos' ideology runs deep. It'll take time, decades of rebuilding, re-education, and integration. We need to fund the opposition groups within their societies. If we can turn their people against each other, it will weaken the remnants of Xarathos. Destabilization is a tactic, the advisor mused. It could work, but we'll need to manage the chaos carefully, or we'll end up with even more radical groups. One step at a time, Reyna said. First, we ensure the planets can't unite under a new leader. Then we rebuild their societies in a way that aligns with secular values. Kalen's still reeling from the battles he had fought, stood on the surface of Thraxis, one of the planets they had just taken. He watched as the soldiers disarmed the remaining Xarathos forces, many of whom were children, barely old enough to hold a weapon. The sight made his stomach turn. "Look at them," a fellow soldier said, standing beside him. "They're just kids. They don't even know what they're fighting for." Kayla nodded slowly. "Xarathos taught them one thing: fight, die, and be rewarded in the afterlife. They don't know anything else." "Do you think they'll stop fighting?" the soldier asked. Kalen looked over at the young prisoners, their eyes full of hatred, defiance, and confusion. He shook his head. "No, not for a long time." 7. The cycle of conflict. Though the secular forces had taken control of the 6 planets, the cycle of conflict continued. Insurgencies broke out in areas where the secular forces had less control. And in colonies where opposition movements had been funded, civil wars erupted. It was a strategy designed to destabilize the remnants of Xarathos, keeping their forces divided and their leadership weak. But it also meant that peace was far off. The galaxy had been plunged into a new era of constant skirmishes, political unrest, and underground resistance. As Rael and Lyra walked through the streets of Karvan, now occupied by secular soldiers, they both knew that the galaxy had changed forever. The war against Xarathos had been brutal, but it wasn't over. It had merely shifted into a new form, one where the battle wasn't for land or power, but for the minds of the people. "We've won," Lyra said softly, but her voice was filled with doubt. Rael shook his head. "No. We've just moved into the next phase. The real fight is just beginning." The victory had come at a great cost. Millions of lives had been lost, and the galaxy had been torn apart. But as the secular alliance began to rebuild the 6 planets, the shadows of Xarathos still loomed large. Because even as the planets were brought under secular control, the belief in Xarathos, the idea that had driven so many to fight and die, remained. And until that belief was fully extinguished, the war would never truly be over, to be continued. In the next chapter, the focus will shift to the rebuilding process, the challenges of governing occupied planets, and the emergence of new threats from within the fragmented remains of Xarathos. The galaxy stands on the brink of a new era, one filled with uncertainty, unrest, and the lingering specter of theocratic extremism. The question is no longer about victory or defeat. It is about how the galaxy will learn to live with the consequences of war. Chapter 17. The Murder of God. The war had brought Malik to a place he never imagined. Once a follower of the secular path, believing in the power of choice, freedom, and individuality, he had come face to face with the depths of fanaticism. Now, standing in the darkened halls of the last remaining Xarathos temple on Karvan, Malik prepared for a confrontation that would define not only the future of the galaxy, but the end of an era. Before him stood the Keeper of the Flame, the hidden leader of Xarathos, the man who had pulled the strings from the shadows, guiding the faith even as its public leaders fell one by one. This was the man who still held sway over the most fanatical believers, the man who had watched as millions died in the name of a god he had crafted to control them. Malik, now hardened by the war, had no mercy left in his heart. Today, he would destroy Xarathos not just through force, but with words that would cut to the bone. 1. The last debate. The Keeper of the Flame was an old man, his body weakened by years of ruling from the shadows, but his eyes still gleamed with the fanatic fire that had kept Xarathos alive for so long. He stood tall, despite the wreckage of the temple around him, facing Malik with a quiet arrogance. "Malik," the Keeper said, his voice low but steady, "do you think by standing here you have defeated Xarathos? Do you believe your secular armies, your weapons, your technology have conquered the divine? You are nothing." Malik's eyes were cold as he took a step forward. "You and your god are relics. Xarathos isn't divine. It's a prison you built to enslave people. You twisted faith into chains, forcing people to die for your fantasies of power. The Keeper sneered. You think freedom will save the galaxy? You think your secular values will bring order? No. Without Xarathos, humanity will descend into chaos. Xarathos offers order. It offers meaning. Without us, people are lost. Malik laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the empty chamber. Order? Meaning? Is that what you call it? I call it cowardice. You hide behind your God because you're too afraid to face the reality that there is no order, no divine plan. The universe doesn't care about you or your pathetic rules. Xarathos is a lie. And you're just a con man peddling it to the weak. The Keeper's eyes narrowed, his voice rising in anger. How dare you speak such blasphemy? Xarathos is eternal. It is the light that guides us all. You are a traitor to the truth. Malik's lips curled into a dark smile. Truth? You don't know the meaning of the word. You hide behind scripture, behind ancient laws written by men too afraid to live without them. You and your kind are nothing but moral parasites feeding on the fear of the ignorant. The Keeper bristled, his fists clenched at his sides. You would have been put to death under the old laws for abandoning the faith. Xarathos commands loyalty, and those who betray it deserve only death. Malik took another step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Too bad for you. Now I can choose. I can reject your God, your laws, your entire twisted faith, and there's nothing you can do about it. The Keeper stared at him, his face pale with rage. You are a murderer of God. Malik's gaze was cold and unyielding. Yes, I am the murderer of God. I killed him because he was weak, because he offered nothing but chains and fear. And now, I'll help others see that they can kill him too. The Keeper stumbled back, his eyes wide with fury and fear. Malik's words were not just an attack on the faith, they were a rejection of everything Xarathos stood for. Your God is dead, Malik said, his voice ringing through the chamber. And you're nothing without him. 2. The fall of the Keeper. The conversation ended with a silence so thick it felt like the entire room had been swallowed by it. The Keeper of the Flame, his face contorted in rage and disbelief, made no move to counter Malik's final words. He had no argument left. The secular forces had destroyed his armies, obliterated his fleets, and now Malik had destroyed his soul. With a gesture, Malik signaled the secular soldiers who stood behind him. Take him, Malik ordered. His time is over. The soldiers moved swiftly, seizing the Keeper and placing him in restraints. For all his bluster, the old man offered no resistance. Xarathos had fallen, and its final leader had been captured. As the soldiers led the Keeper away, Malik stood alone in the temple, staring at the fading mural on the wall, a depiction of the ancient gods of Xarathos. False gods, he thought, shaking his head. Gods created to control, to manipulate. And now they were dead, just like the man who had claimed to serve them. 3. Rescue and rebirth. With the capture of the Keeper of the Flame, the final stage of the war was underway. Malik joined the secular forces as they launched a rescue mission to free the remaining hostages held by the Xarathos fanatics. These were the last remnants of the war, the innocents who had been taken as trophies, as bargaining chips to keep the war alive. Malik's unit swept through the remaining strongholds, encountering resistance from the last few zealots still loyal to Xarathos. But the fanatics were weak now, their faith shattered by the fall of their leaders. One by one, the strongholds were liberated, and the hostages freed. In the final moments of the rescue mission, Malik found himself standing before a group of civilians, men, women, and children, who had been held captive for months. Their eyes were hollow with fear and exhaustion, but when they saw the secular soldiers, their faces lit up with hope. You're free, Malik said quietly, helping an elderly man to his feet. It's over. Xarathos is gone. The survivors stared at him, tears in their eyes. For them, the war had been a nightmare, one that had lasted far too long. But now, Thanks to Malik and the secular forces, the nightmare was finally ending. 4. Deconstruction of Xarathos. With the war over, the focus of the secular forces turned to the deconstruction of Xarathos' influence in the galaxy. Malik, who had once believed in the faith himself, led the charge to dismantle the theocratic structures that had held so many in thrall for so long. It was a slow and painful process. Many of the people on the Xarathos-controlled planets still clung to the old ways, unable to imagine a life without the rigid order their faith had provided. But Malik knew that freedom could only come through the destruction of old gods. "We will build a new society," Malik said in a speech to the newly freed people of Karvan. "A society where you are free to choose your own path, to live without fear of divine retribution, to define your own meaning. Xarathos is dead. Now it is time for you to live." The secular forces worked tirelessly to rebuild the planets that had been devastated by the war. They established schools, restructured governments, and ensured that the fanaticism of Xarathos could never rise again. Where the faith had once dictated every aspect of life, now there was choice, debate, and freedom. But Malik knew that the battle wasn't truly over. The war might have ended, but the scars of Xarathos' oppression ran deep. It would take years, perhaps generations, to fully heal the wounds left by the faith. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope. 5. The end of an era. As Malik stood on the balcony of the secular headquarters, overlooking the ruins of Karvan, Lyra joined him. Together they watched as the city slowly began to rebuild, the people rising from the ashes of a war that had consumed them for so long. "Do you think it's really over?" Lyra asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Malik didn't answer immediately. He knew the rebuilding process would be long and difficult. There would be resistance, pockets of believers who still clung to the old ways. But the power of Xarathos had been broken, and the gods they had created had been slain. "It's over," Malik said finally. "And now, we can begin again." As the sun set over the city, Malik turned to Lyra with a faint smile. "We've killed their god. Now it's time to live without one." The war had ended. The galaxy had been saved from the tyranny of faith. And though the road ahead would be difficult, Malik knew that for the first time in generations,